Section 1. The Vault Behind the Vault. There is something deeply satisfying about knowing that the version of a story you were given was not the only version that ever existed. Somewhere between the pitch and the broadcast, between the table read and the animation studio, between the first nervous laugh in a writer's room and the final cut that aired to millions of people on a Sunday night, things were left behind. Lines were trimmed. Scenes were pulled. Whole stories were sealed away in filing cabinets and storage drives, and the collective memory of people who were sworn, by network contract and professional habit, to keep quiet about them. And then there is Family Guy. If you want a show that turned the act of being censored, banned, and edited into its own strange art form, you do not have to look very far. From the very first episode that aired on the 31st of January, 1999, all the way through more than 20 seasons of arguments with Fox's Standards and Practices Department, the show that Seth MacFarlane built in a kitchen with $50,000 in a dream, has a shadow archive that runs almost as long and as strange as the show itself. Tonight, we are going to open that archive together. We are going to walk slowly through the corridors of everything that was written for this show and never seen, everything that aired once and was pulled from the record, everything that exists only on specific DVD releases, everything that was altered at the request of network executives, government agencies, foreign broadcasting bodies, and occasionally common human decency. We are going to do this slowly because slow is the right pace for this kind of story. These are not headlines. These are whispers. These are the moments that happened in green screen recording booths where nobody was supposed to be taking notes. These are the scenes that animated artists drew and colored and shaded and then watched get removed from the final cut. Those scenes quietly folded into a drawer and forgotten until someone opened a DVD commentary track and let the secret out. If you are settling in tonight, if you have your blanket, if the room is dim and the world outside has gone quiet, then you are exactly where this story wants you to be. Family Guy premiered on a night when it had an unfair advantage. The first episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, aired immediately following Super Bowl 33, which gave it a captive audience of roughly 22 million people who were already watching television and had nowhere particularly urgent to be. That is one of the most valuable time slots that exists in the American broadcast landscape. And Fox knew exactly what they were doing when they scheduled a brand new animated comedy starring a talking dog and an evil baby directly after the biggest sporting event of the year. The pilot itself had a complicated history before it ever reached those 22 million living rooms. Seth MacFarlane, who was 24 years old when the show premiered and had grown up in Kent, Connecticut, drawing cartoons as a child and studying animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, had created two short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a bumbling, middle-aged man and his highly intelligent talking dog. When Fox saw them, the executives contacted MacFarlane and asked him to develop a full series. They gave him $50,000 and asked him to produce a 15-minute pilot. To put that in perspective, most half-hour animated pilots at the time cost around $1 million to produce. $50,000 was a fraction of that. MacFarlane animated much of the pilot himself, working out of his apartment with what was essentially a skeleton crew. He created the Griffin family, gave Lois red hair instead of the blonde hair she had in the original shorts, cast Seth Green as Chris, brought in Alex Borstein to voice Lois, and built the world of the fictional Rhode Island town that would house the show for the next quarter century. That original 15-minute pilot that MacFarlane pitched to Fox in 1998 was considered partially lost for most of the show's history. The first 7 minutes of it were released on the Volume 2 DVD set in 2003, but the remaining footage was replaced with a coming soon bumper, and the rest was assumed to be gone. It was not until March of 2025 when an internet user named Ghost the Dead Girl discovered the full 16-minute pilot on the personal portfolio website of Robert Paulson, an animator who had worked on it, that the complete version resurfaced. Paulson had uploaded it to his site back in September of 2022, but nobody noticed it for nearly 2.5 years. The pilot had differences from the final broadcast version that are worth settling into for a moment. In the original pitch, Lois had blonde hair. The character designs for Meg, Chris, and Stewie were slightly different. Several scenes that appear in the broadcast episode had not yet been written, and the episode ended differently. MacFarlane himself voices Chris in the original pitch pilot, because Seth Green had not yet been cast. What is remarkable about watching the pilot today is how fully formed the core sensibility already was. The humor, the timing, the rhythm of the family's dysfunction, it was all present in that small apartment in the late 90s. The world that would become a $2 billion franchise was there in rough sketch form, waiting for someone to run the numbers and say yes. Fox said yes, and then they started saying no to things, which is where our story really begins. Because the relationship between Family Guy and the network that aired it was never straightforward. From the very beginning, there was a tension between what the show wanted to do and what the network was willing to broadcast. Fox gave MacFarlane enormous creative latitude compared to what most showrunners receive, but that latitude had edges, and those edges would be tested constantly over the following decades. The first 3 seasons of the show were not primarily defined by censorship battles. They were defined by something rarer and in some ways more valuable, which was the sense that everybody involved was trying to make something genuinely good. MacFarlane was involved in every stage of production. The writers he had assembled, including Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, were working in close creative collaboration with their creator. The show that aired on Fox on those Thursday and Tuesday nights, before the audience lost track of the scheduling, was, by the accounts of everyone who made it, a show being made with care. And even then, things were being cut. Even in those earliest seasons, the gap between what was written and what aired existed. Scenes involving the Kennedy assassination were removed. A joke involving a G.I. Joe toy line was initially cut from the broadcast version of the premiere episode before being restored. A moment where Peter drinks communion wine at church was pulled from the Fox airing. Small moments, early adjustments, the first signs of a negotiation between the show's creative instincts and the institutional caution of a broadcast network. Those earliest cuts feel like gentle clearing of a throat compared to what was coming. But they matter because they tell you something about the nature of the archive that was being built from day one. Family Guy did not start getting censored in its 4th season. It started getting censored from the very first episode. The difference is just that by the 4th season, the content being removed had gotten considerably more ambitious, and the fights over what stayed and what went had gotten considerably louder. There is something almost meditative about sitting with this information. The idea that the show you watched growing up, the version that aired, was already a compromise. That every episode you remember is the version that survived, and somewhere in the quiet of whatever physical storage holds the show's production materials, the fuller version still exists, breathing slowly in the dark. We are going to spend a long time in that darkness tonight. Before we move forward into the seasons and the stories, take a moment if you want to drop a comment and let us know what time and place you are watching from. There is something genuinely warm about imagining all the different corners of the world where this is playing right now. And if this kind of content is your thing, subscribing is the single best way to make sure more of it finds its way to you. It costs nothing and means everything for a small channel like this one. Now let's go further back before we go forward. Section 1 continued. The world the show was born into. There is a version of the story of Family Guy that begins with a single man in an apartment, drawing characters by hand with $50,000 and a borrowed sense of purpose. That version is true as far as it goes, but it leaves out the world the show was born into, and the world mattered enormously to what the show became and what it was eventually prevented from becoming. The late 90s were a specific moment in the history of American broadcast comedy. The Simpsons had been on the air since 1989 and had, by 1999, already transformed the expectations for what an animated show could do with character, satire, and emotional depth. South Park had premiered in 1997 on Comedy Central and was already generating outrage, admiration, and a particular kind of attention that comes from a show that seems to have no fear of consequences. King of the Hill was doing something quieter and in many ways more difficult, building a comedy out of sincerity and specificity in a cultural moment that sometimes mistook sincerity for weakness. Into this environment came a young man from Connecticut with a Rhode Island School of Design degree and a head full of comedy influences that spanned big band jazz, classic Hollywood musicals, the Flintstones, Looney Tunes, and the kind of Irish Catholic working-class New England personality that he had spent his childhood observing. Seth MacFarlane was not trying to be The Simpsons. He was not trying to be South Park. He was trying to be something that had not quite existed before, a show that used animation to do things that were impossible in live action, that used cutaway gags as a comedy delivery system, that placed a genuinely evil baby and a genuinely literate talking dog in a family so structurally familiar that the strangeness of those elements would be constantly and productively in collision with the normalcy around them. The show that Fox agreed to produce in 1998 was, on paper, a family sitcom. A father, a mother, 3 children, and a dog living in a fictional Rhode Island town. The format was as old as television itself. What MacFarlane was proposing to do with that format was something else entirely, and the gap between the reassuring familiarity of the structure and the radical strangeness of the content was the engine that made the first 3 seasons work as well as they did. Fox's decision to place the premiere of this show immediately after Super Bowl 33 on January 31st, 1999 was a statement of confidence. You do not give your most coveted post-game slot to a show you are uncertain about. The network believed in what they had seen in the pilot, and 22 million viewers showed up on a Sunday night and discovered the Griffin family, and the world was different after that in the small but real way that good television always changes the world. The 22 million viewers that night could not have known what they were watching the beginning of. They could not have known that the show would be canceled twice and come back both times, stronger each return. They could not have known that the talking dog and the evil baby would become among the most recognized animated characters in the world. They could not have known that the show would spend decades in negotiation with network censors, government regulators, foreign broadcasting authorities, and its own creators' evolving relationship to it. They were just watching a funny show about a family. And it was funny. And the world was not yet aware of what it would become. The comment section below is a good place to drop in and tell us what time and place you are watching from right now. There is something genuinely warm about imagining all the different corners of the world where this is playing, the different time zones and the different kinds of dark, and the different states of half-sleep that are hosting this story tonight. If you are new here, subscribing is free and it matters more than you might think for a channel trying to build something thoughtful in a corner of the internet that does not always reward patience. Now, let us go deeper into the history of the show and the people and institutions that shaped what it could and could not be. Section 2. The censors, the network, and the war that shaped everything. To understand what was never supposed to air, you need to understand who was deciding what could air and why. Fox Broadcasting Company in the late 1990s and early 2000s was not a monolith. It was a network that had built its identity on being the disruptive choice, the place where The Simpsons had aired its first episode in 1989, where Married with Children had spent years doing things that the other networks would never have touched. Fox had a history of airing content that the more established networks considered risky. That was part of its brand. But Fox also had a standards and practices department, the division of the network responsible for reviewing content before broadcast and flagging anything that violated Federal Communications Commission regulations or the network's own internal guidelines. Every major American broadcast network has one. The FCC, which stands for Federal Communications Commission, is the government body that regulates broadcast television in the United States and has the authority to fine networks for content deemed indecent or obscene. The fines were not enormous in the early years of Family Guy, sitting at around $27,500 per violation, but the threat of public regulatory action and the reputational implications of an FCC investigation were enough to make networks careful. The relationship between a show's creative team and the Standards and Practices Department is, in most cases, an ongoing negotiation. It is not a simple binary of allowed and forbidden. It is a conversation, sometimes a heated one, in which the writers push for something, the network evaluates the request in the context of their regulatory obligations and advertiser relationships, and a compromise is reached. Sometimes that compromise means a line gets changed. Sometimes a scene gets cut. Sometimes, as happened with Family Guy on more than one occasion, an entire episode is produced and then quietly buried. MacFarlane has been candid in interviews about the nature of this relationship. In a 2009 interview with the New York Times blog, when asked about the dynamic, He described the process in terms that were frank about the frustration, but also realistic about the constraints. He understood that Fox had the right not to air content they found problematic. He did not always agree with their decisions, but he understood the structure. What he was less accepting of was when the constraints felt arbitrary, when something that was clearly satirical or clearly within the bounds of what the show had always done was suddenly treated as a line that could not be crossed. The FCC's authority changed dramatically in February of 2004. In January of that year, during the halftime show of Super Bowl 38, singer Justin Timberlake tore away part of Janet Jackson's costume, briefly exposing her breast to an estimated 90 million viewers. The incident, which became known in the media as a wardrobe malfunction, triggered an enormous regulatory response. The FCC received an extraordinary number of complaints, the largest in its history up to that point, and the agency used the incident as justification to dramatically increase its enforcement stance on broadcast indecency. The fine per violation jumped from $27,500 to $325,000, an increase of more than 10 times. This change in the regulatory environment had direct consequences for Family Guy. The show was already in production on its fourth season when the wardrobe malfunction happened, and MacFarlane and his writing team were acutely aware that the standards they had operated under during the first 3 seasons no longer fully applied. Things that had been permitted, or at least tolerated, in the early years were now subject to a much more aggressive review. The network's standards and practices team became more active, more careful, and more inclined to pull material that might attract regulatory attention. The show's response to this situation was characteristic. Rather than simply complying with the new environment, the writers made the environment itself into an episode. In Season 4, Episode 14, titled PTV, Peter discovers that the FCC, represented in the episode by Cobra Commander from the G.I. Joe cartoon series, has launched a campaign of censorship following a wardrobe malfunction at the Emmy Awards. Peter creates his own television network called PTV, broadcasting whatever he wants without restriction. When Lois convinces the FCC to shut Peter's network down, they begin censoring real life, placing black bars over Peter's body when he leaves the shower, drowning out loud noises with air horns, and overdubbing farts with Stephen Wright punchlines. The episode is a direct piece of satire aimed at the regulatory environment the show was operating in. MacFarlane later described making it as coming out of, in his own words, rage. Rage over all the things the crew had to deal with since the Janet Jackson incident. He was making a show about censorship while actively having the episode censored, and the irony ran deep. During production of PTV, the writers were having their usual back-and-forth negotiations with Fox's internal censors. According to a 2005 report in the Chicago Tribune, the production team ended up in what the paper described as horse trading with the network, giving up a body part reference in exchange for being allowed to keep a dirty word. Dan Povenmire, who directed the episode and who would later go on to create Phineas and Ferb, recalled in the DVD commentary that the writing staff was disappointed by how many scenes had been removed from the episode, but they were ultimately happy with what remained. What they were not allowed to keep in the Fox broadcast version was the douchebags sequence. In this deleted portion of the episode, Peter and Cleveland, in a parody of the MTV show Jackass, engaged in a crude stunt over a highway overpass. The Fox censors told the production team that the sequence could stay in the episode if specific edits were made, including not showing Peter pulling down his pants and removing the audio of Peter's waist hitting Lois's car windshield below. MacFarlane decided it was simpler to cut the sequence entirely and replace it with a different scene that pushed Lois to call the FCC. The douchebag sequence ended up on the DVD release, where the show's uncut content lived more freely. This pattern of something being written, being partially or fully removed from the broadcast version, and then appearing on the DVD became one of the defining structural features of Family Guy across most of its run. The DVD releases were where the show's full creative intentions existed. The broadcast version was the negotiated product. The DVD releases were also a financial lifeline. The show had been canceled twice, first in 2002 and then again briefly before the revival, and the DVD sales of the first and second seasons had been instrumental in convincing Fox to bring the show back in 2005. The volume sold more than 400,000 copies in their early release window, an extraordinary number for a canceled cartoon. And the sales proved to Fox that there was a passionate and committed audience for this show, even when it was off the air. That relationship between the DVD marketplace and the survival of the show created an interesting incentive structure. The network had reason to make the broadcast version somewhat more conservative than the full creative vision, because the additional content on the DVD releases gave viewers a reason to purchase the physical media. The uncensored material was, in a sense, a value add that could be marketed. This was not unique to Family Guy. Other animated shows had noticed the same dynamic. But Family Guy leaned into it more explicitly than most, sometimes structuring the DVD releases to include extended scenes, alternate cuts, and deleted content that was clearly meant to reward the fans who sought out the physical versions. The writer's relationship with Fox's censors also evolved over time. In the early seasons, when the show was still finding its footing and the regulatory environment was somewhat less strict, the negotiations tended to be relatively minor. A line here, a word there. The writers pushed, the censors evaluated, a compromise was reached. By the fourth season and beyond, as both the show's content and the regulatory environment had escalated, the negotiations became more substantive and more consequential. There is a detail from the production of PTV that tells you something about how this dynamic worked at the granular level. According to the DVD commentary, the scene where Quagmire passes out after overhearing Peter say something suggestive originally had Quagmire holding a running garden hose. Fox standards found it too obscene because the running hose, in their assessment, looked too much like a male body part in the context of the joke. The hose was replaced with a newspaper. That is not a trivial change. That is a network censor telling an animation studio to redraw a prop because the shape of a piece of garden equipment was considered too suggestive. If you want a concrete example of how detailed and specific these negotiations could get, there it is. And then there was the matter of the episode that Fox felt so uncomfortable with that they refused to air it at all, not just edit it. That story belongs to a later section of this journey, because the episode in question, titled Partial Terms of Endearment, represents the furthest that the network's censorship authority was ever exercised over this show. But it had predecessors, smaller acts of suppression, that built toward that final, most dramatic refusal. The earliest of these predecessors came in the second season. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was originally intended to air in the year 2000 as part of the show's second season output. It had the production code designation of 2ACX05, placing it early in that season's production order. But Fox looked at the episode and expressed concern that its content, which centered on Peter befriending a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, and then trying to convert his son Chris to Judaism, could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. The episode sat in a drawer for 3 years. 3 years. The episode was produced. It was animated. The voice performances had been recorded. And then it was held, quietly, while the show around it continued to evolve. By the time Adult Swim aired it in November of 2003, Family Guy had been canceled and brought back, and the episode itself was a curiosity, a piece of the show's history that existed outside the normal chronology. Fox eventually aired a censored version of the episode in December of 2004, 4 years after it was supposed to first appear. The censored version made a specific change to the song I Need a Jew, which was Peter's musical number in the episode, a parody of the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star. In the original version, and on the DVD, the lyric reads, Even though they killed my lord. In the Fox broadcast version, the line was changed to I don't think they killed my lord. If you watch the Fox version carefully, you can see that Peter's mouth is still moving to the original lyric. The animation was not changed, only the audio. There is something almost dreamlike about that image. A character's mouth forming words that the audience cannot hear. A record of an intention that was deemed too uncomfortable to broadcast, visible but silent. That is what censorship looks like when you look closely at it. Not a dramatic erasure, but a quiet gap. Something that was there and is now not quite there. A mouth moving without a voice. Section 3. The early seasons and the first hidden material. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy, which aired between 1999 and 2002 before the show's first cancellation, are the material that the show's most devoted fans return to. They are the seasons that people reference when they talk about when the show was good, when it had heart, when the characters felt like real people rather than vehicles for shock. They are also the seasons from which the least deleted material has ever officially surfaced. This is significant. Starting with the fourth season revival in 2005, Fox began including DVD extras that featured deleted scenes, extended sequences, and occasionally alternative cuts of episodes. The DVD releases from season 4 onward became a secondary archive of the show's creative intentions. But for seasons 1, 2, and 3, this secondary archive was largely absent. The deleted scenes from those first 3 seasons never made it to the public in any organized way. What we know about what was cut from those seasons comes from a combination of sources. There are the Lost Media wiki entries that document what fans have managed to track down or confirm. There are the DVD commentaries, which MacFarlane and other members of the production team recorded for the early seasons, and which occasionally mention things that had been cut. There is the Internet Archive, which holds the table draft of the first episode, giving researchers a window into what the show looked like before it was finalized. And there are the occasional interviews and articles that came out in the years immediately following the first cancellation, when people involved with the show were more willing to talk about what the process had been like. The table draft of the very first episode, Death Has a Shadow, is available through the Internet Archive and contains a scene that never made it into the broadcast version. In this deleted scene, Chris walks off a dinner table and announces that he is going to get wasted, and Peter, his father, calls after him to look both ways. The joke is a throwaway gag about a child's desire to drink, but it was cut from the final broadcast version before the episode aired in January of 1999. The reason for the cut is not documented in any official commentary, but the timing suggests that someone in the production process decided the joke read differently when it was a child making the statement rather than an adult. Another scene from the table draft of the pilot involved Peter and the rest of the Griffin family riding a 5-person bicycle together. Thanks to Peter's weight, the family falls off and crashes, and they all laugh together. The Lost Media wiki documentation of this scene notes that only 2 seconds of the Griffins pedaling can be seen in a behind-the-scenes clip that was released separately. The rest of the scene is documented in the table draft but was never animated and never made it to the broadcast. It is a small moment, quiet and genuinely affectionate, the kind of family comedy beat that the early show did well. The fact that it exists only in a script on the Internet Archive is a small melancholy. Then there is the matter of the Kennedy Pez dispenser gag. In the 5th episode of the first season, A Hero Sits Next Door, a young boy walks out of a store holding a Pez dispenser shaped like President John F. Kennedy. A stray bullet from a police officer's weapon hits the dispenser and knocks off the head, at which point the boy produces a second Pez dispenser in the shape of Robert F. Kennedy. This gag was deemed so offensive that it was removed not only from many subsequent television broadcasts, but also from the American DVD release. It appears on some international DVD releases and was eventually made available through certain streaming versions, but it was treated as radioactive material for years after the episode first aired. The joke landed in a particular way because it was not just referencing assassinations in the abstract. It was using the bodies of specific, beloved political figures as props for a Pez dispenser gag, and the specificity made it considerably more uncomfortable than a more general reference would have been. There is a through line here that runs all the way from that first cut Kennedy joke through to the much larger controversies of the later seasons. The show's willingness to make comedy out of things that were considered sacred, whether that meant the deaths of political figures, the events of September 11th, the subject of abortion, or the format of a Boston Marathon, was both the source of its most memorable humor and the reason that the archive of what was pulled from it runs so long and so strange. The second season brought the most consequential early cut of all. Road to Rhode Island aired on May 30th, 2000, more than a year before the September 11th attacks. In the episode, when Stewie and Brian arrive at the airport, Stewie realizes that his bag is full of weapons. His solution is to break into a performance of On the Good Ship Lollipop to distract the airport security officers from noticing what is in his luggage as it goes through the X-ray machine. After successfully getting through security, Stewie remarks, "Let's hope Osama bin Laden doesn't know show tunes." The camera then cuts to bin Laden standing in another security line, distracting his own scanner by singing "I Hope I Get It" from the musical A Chorus Line. When the episode first aired in May of 2000, this was a joke. Osama bin Laden was a known figure and a known threat. But the September 11th attacks had not happened, and the scene played as the kind of absurdist political humor that the show had always included. Then the attacks happened on September 11th, 2001, and the scene became something different. MacFarlane himself was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11 that morning. He had been booked on the flight that was hijacked and crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A combination of having been given the wrong departure time by his travel agent and a hangover from the previous night caused him to miss the flight by about 10 minutes. The bin Laden scene was cut from all subsequent reruns of Road to Rhode Island and was removed from the Volume 1 DVD release. The scene stayed gone for years, absent not just from television, but from the physical media that was supposed to be the uncensored home of the show's full creative work. It eventually appeared on the Family Guy, The Freakin' Sweet Collection DVD, a specialty release put out in 2004, and was later restored to the Hulu streaming version after 2017. But for a significant portion of the show's history, one of the most cited early examples of the show's dark humor existed only in the memory of people who had watched that first broadcast on a Tuesday night in late May of 2000. MacFarlane's own DVD commentary on the episode, recorded for the Freakin' Sweet Collection, included a line that became something of a rueful punchline. He said, in character as Brian, that the moral of the story was that the FBI should watch Family Guy more often. There is something here that is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet of this night. The scene was not threatening. It was not malicious. It was a joke made by a young animator about a known figure, made in a world where that figure's capacity for the kind of catastrophic violence that would follow was known, but had not yet been realized. The scene became something else only because the world became something else. And the removal of the scene was not a matter of legal obligation or regulatory pressure. It was a matter of human sensitivity. A judgment call that the scene could not be shown anymore because what it depicted had become too entangled with grief that was still raw. That is a different kind of cut than a censorship note from Standards and Practices about the word. In a lyric or the shape of a garden hose. That is the kind of cut that tells you something about what comedy does with tragedy, and what happens when a joke outlives the world in which it was funny. The third season contained the most famous of the early holdback episodes. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein sat in a drawer for 3 years, and when it finally emerged, it did so in multiple formats. The Adult Swim version in 2003 was essentially uncut but contained its own edits from the network's standards. The Fox version in 2004 was the most censored, with the lyric change in the I Need a Jew song and a shortened version of the Quagmire reaching for his keys scene. A gag whose humor depends entirely on its duration and which the shortened version essentially ruined. The original table draft version of the episode, which had a table read on March 17, 1999, was different again from the final produced version. The early draft had a different framing story, different secondary plot elements, and some content that was deemed too much even for the fairly permissive Adult Swim broadcast. The original draft was presumed lost until April 2020, when a Twitter user called Classic Swim shared portions of the script, and it was eventually uploaded in full to the Internet Archive in July 2025. The full original cut of the episode, as it was read aloud on that March day in 1999, had apparently received a poor reception at the table read. The episode underwent significant revisions after that initial reading, and the production schedule was reshuffled to accommodate the changes, with other episodes moving up a slot. There is something quietly poignant about imagining that table read. A room full of people in 1999 reading an episode that would not air for 4 years, laughing at some of it, not laughing at some of it, adjusting and debating and eventually deciding that significant changes were needed. The episode that emerged from that process was not exactly the episode that was originally conceived. The episode that eventually aired on Fox in 2004 was not exactly the episode that emerged from the production process. Every version of the story that exists is a different layer of the same material, each one shaped by a different set of constraints and conversations. The first 3 seasons also contained smaller cuts that never received the same kind of documentation as the major holdbacks. The Lost Media Wiki's entry on Family Guy's first 3 seasons notes that only 3 deleted scenes from the first season can be confirmed from old commercials and a behind-the-scenes clip, and that the rest of the material cut from those early episodes has never been publicly released in any form. The deleted scenes that were included as DVD extras from Season 4 onward were simply not a feature of the earlier releases, and whatever was cut from those first 50 episodes, the quiet moments and the sharp ones, the lines that went too far and the scenes that ran too long, they are gone in a way that the later season's cuts are not. That particular loss has a different texture than the censorship of the more famous moments. The Bin Laden scene can be found if you know where to look. The Kennedy Pez dispenser gag exists on specific DVD releases. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein original draft is on the Internet Archive. But the scene of the Griffin family laughing together as they fall off a bicycle on a quiet afternoon, the moment that was written for the very first episode and never made it to the screen, that one is just gone. Not suppressed, not held back for regulatory reasons, not preserved on a specialist DVD release. Just absent. Just the gap between what was imagined and what was made. The gap is where tonight's story lives. Section 4. The Cancellation Era. What Fox buried when they pulled the plug. The first cancellation of Family Guy in the spring of 2002 did not happen dramatically. There was no formal announcement during a press conference. There was no climactic standoff between MacFarlane and the network. The show had been moved around the schedule so many times, Thursday nights against Frasier, Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, various slots that never gave the audience enough stability to build consistent viewership, that by the time the cancellation came, it felt almost like an administrative formality. The ratings had suffered. Fox exercised their option not to order a fourth season. The show ended. What this meant practically was that the writers' room, which had been developing ideas and scripts for what would have been a fourth season, suddenly had nowhere to go. The scripts that were in progress were shelved. The production staff dispersed. Seth MacFarlane moved on to other work while keeping a quiet watch on the show's fortunes in syndication. There is a specific quality to the material that was prepared in the period between the end of Season 3 and the show's revival in 2005. The writers knew that the show had been canceled. They knew that the episodes they were drafting would not have a broadcast home in the immediate future. In some cases, they may not have known whether the show would ever return at all. The writing done during that limbo period has a particular relationship with censorship because, in a sense, nobody was censoring it. There was no network to push back. There was no standards and practices department reviewing the scripts. The material existed in a kind of creative free space, accountable only to the judgment of the people who were making it. When Fox Cartoon Network bought the rights to air Family Guy reruns on Adult Swim, for what was, by all accounts, an extremely low price because nobody thought the show had much value at that point, the Adult Swim airings brought significant changes to what had been broadcast. Adult Swim had different content standards than Fox. Content that Fox had muted or cut could be shown on Adult Swim with more latitude, and the reruns that aired on the cable block were, in many cases, closer to the original creative intentions than the Fox broadcasts had been. The Adult Swim premiere on April 20th, 2003 was a revelatory moment for the show's second life. The reruns drew extraordinary ratings for the block, boosting Adult Swim's viewership by 239%, according to contemporary reports. People who had never caught the show during its original run were discovering it for the first time. People who had watched it during its original run were rediscovering it with the particular warmth that comes from watching something you loved and thought you had lost. And some of those viewers were noticing, for the first time, content in the reruns that they did not remember from the original Fox broadcasts. Not all of the Adult Swim airings were substantially different from the Fox versions, but enough of them contained material that had been edited or bleeped on Fox to give audiences the sense that there was a fuller version of the show that they had not previously seen. This realization was a powerful one. It contributed to the massive DVD sales that followed the reruns. Fans were not just buying the DVDs to have the show in a physical format. They were buying them to see the parts that had been cut from the broadcast. The discs were, in the popular understanding, the real version of the show. The DVD releases from the cancellation period also included material that had been produced for the third season and altered for broadcast. The Volume 2 DVD set, which came out in September of 2003, included When You Wish Upon a Weinstein as a bonus episode, the first time it had been publicly available to American audiences in any form. The set also included commentaries from MacFarlane and other members of the production team, and those commentaries are a remarkable resource for understanding what the show had been through. In the commentary for Deep Throats, a fourth season episode that would air after the revival, MacFarlane and the team discuss a scene involving Peter and Lois on the couch that was significantly altered for the Fox broadcast. In the original version, Peter and Lois are completely nude, and Lois is making a sexually suggestive remark to Brian. In the Fox version, undergarments were drawn onto the characters and Lois's line was removed. The Adult Swim version showed the scene with the nudity intact and the suggestive dialogue present, and this version also made it to the DVD release. The joke in the scene, which hinges on the juxtaposition of Brian's horror and the couple's apparent obliviousness, essentially does not work in the Fox version, because the thing that makes it absurd and funny, the specific nature of what Brian is walking in on, has been removed. There are dozens of moments like this scattered throughout the show's run. Not just scenes that were banned or episodes that were held back, but individual jokes that depended on a specific element that was then removed, making the surviving version of the joke incomplete. The surrounding setup remains. The punchline is gone. You can feel the shape of what was supposed to be there, like a room where a piece of furniture has been removed, and the dents in the carpet still show where the legs used to sit. The cancellation era also saw something else happen that rarely gets discussed in the context of the show's content history, and that is the development of the voice cast's full range of expression for these characters. During the original run, the recordings were made under the usual broadcast constraints. After the cancellation, when some of the cast returned to record DVD commentary tracks and to participate in promotional material, they were operating in a different environment. The cast's own interviews and commentaries from this period, particularly the early DVD releases, have a looseness and a willingness to discuss what the show had been through that the more formal promotional material from the broadcast era did not. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, has spoken in several contexts about how the character's original, slower, deeper voice was modified after MacFarlane's early instruction to speed it up and make it less annoying. The original pilot version of Lois's voice, which can be heard in the 1998 pitch pilot, is noticeably different from the voice that aired on Fox in 1999. The adjustment happened during the transition from pitch to series. This is not a censorship story in the traditional sense, but it is a version of the same phenomenon. A creative intention was modified between its first expression and its public presentation, and the original intention exists only in the pitch pilot that sat in a digital drawer for 27 years. Seth Green has told the story of his audition for Chris, noting that his primary inspiration was the character of Buffalo Bill from the film The Silence of the Lambs, and that he and the casting team were experimenting with the voice of Buffalo Bill as an 11-year-old boy. That is the voice of Chris Griffin. There is something disorienting and also quietly funny about knowing that, because the performance that emerged from that audition, and that millions of people have heard for more than 2 decades, sits at an oblique angle to its own origin. The character that made it to television was a specific transformation of a specific choice made in a casting session, and the trace of that origin is present if you know to listen for it. The cancellation period was, in retrospect, one of the most generative and interesting periods in the show's creative history, precisely because it was the period where the show was free from the pressures that normally shape a broadcast product. There was no schedule to meet. There was no advertiser relationship to manage. There was no standards and practices department reviewing scripts. There was just a group of talented people who loved the show they had made and were trying to figure out what it meant that it was gone. The material from that period, the episodes that aired on Adult Swim, the DVD commentary tracks, the behind-the-scenes footage that made it onto the physical releases, these are artifacts of a creative moment that was brief and unrepeatable. The show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had gone away in 2002, and part of what was different was that the renewal had changed the relationship between the show and its own sense of freedom. The revival came with new pressure, new expectations, new scrutiny. The gap years when nobody was watching because there was nothing to watch were over. Section 5. The Revival and the New Rulebook. When Family Guy returned to Fox for its fourth season in May of 2005, it arrived back in a broadcast landscape that had changed significantly from the one it had left in 2002. The Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction in February of 2004 and the FCC's subsequent crackdown on broadcast indecency had altered what the network was willing to air. American Dad, MacFarlane's second show, was premiering on the same network on the same Sunday animation block. The expectation of success after such a publicly celebrated comeback added its own kind of pressure. The fourth season premiered with North by North Quahog, written by MacFarlane himself, and it landed to the kind of warm reception that the fanbase's enthusiasm had promised. The viewers were back. The cultural conversation around the show was active and engaged, but behind the scenes, the relationship between the show's creative team and Fox's standards reviewers was operating under the new, stricter guidelines that the post-2004 regulatory environment had established. The episode PTV, which we explored earlier, was produced during this period as a direct creative response to the constraints the show was navigating. But it was not the only episode in the fourth season to be affected by the tightened standards. The episode Petarded became one of the more documented examples of a scene that was written, workshopped, and ultimately removed before the broadcast version was finalized. In Petarded, Peter discovers that he qualifies as intellectually disabled after taking an IQ test, and the episode follows what Peter can get away with given this newly established status. The episode itself passed through censorship review with most of its content intact, but a deleted musical number titled Peter is Slow, which parodied the telephone hour sequence from the musical Bye Bye Birdie, was removed entirely before broadcast. In the sequence, news spreads through the neighborhood about Peter's test results through a chain of phone calls, and the song uses a specific derogatory term for people with intellectual disabilities multiple times. According to the DVD commentary, the song uses the term in question, what is now commonly referred to as the R word, more times than the censors could accept, and the entire sequence was cut rather than modified. There is an interesting creative question embedded in this particular cut. The song was a parody of a specific musical number, and parody tends to work by heightening and exaggerating the source material. The parody's joke presumably required the repetition of the term to land properly. Removing individual instances of the word would have changed the rhythm and the point of the song in ways that made the parody less effective. The decision to cut the whole sequence rather than modify it was, in that sense, a creative judgment as much as a compliance one. A different word could have been substituted. The song could have been rewritten. But the choice was made that the sequence without its specific language was not the sequence that had been written, and the whole thing came out. The fourth season also produced what may be the single most quietly documented deleted scene of the show's mid-period, a moment from Peter's Got Woods, involving a certain late American entertainer holding baby Stewie over a hotel balcony railing. This was a reference to a real incident involving Michael Jackson in 2002, in which the entertainer had held his infant son over a balcony railing at a hotel in Berlin, generating widespread media coverage. The Family Guy version of this image was animated as a cutaway gag and then pulled before the episode aired. According to the DVD bonus feature Family Guy, Off the Cutting Room Floor, which released some of this deleted material, no specific explanation was given for why the scene was removed, when the show had, as the documentation points out, said considerably more pointed things about Michael Jackson across its run. The absence of a clear explanation is its own kind of note. Standards and practices decisions do not always come with detailed written rationales. Sometimes the answer is simply that someone in the review process flagged a scene as problematic, and the production team made the decision to pull it rather than fight for it. The cost-benefit analysis of network negotiations over individual cutaway gags is not always visible in the documentary record. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued the pattern of having both more ambitious content and more sophisticated negotiations over what that content could include. The episode Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a romantic obsession with Brian after he takes her to prom, contains an extended sequence in which Meg essentially holds Brian captive in her bedroom. The DVD version of this scene is longer and more explicit than the version that aired on Fox, with additional dialogue that makes the scenario considerably more uncomfortable. The broadcast version already pushed against the limits of what was acceptable for primetime, but the full version pushed further still. The same season contained an extended version of the Brian and Stewie interactions in Road to Rupert that was trimmed for time in the broadcast cut but restored on DVD. The additional material was not censored content in the regulatory sense. It was simply material that did not fit within the episode's runtime. But the distinction between cuts made for time and cuts made for content was often not clearly marked in the production record, and from the viewer's perspective, the result was the same. There was a version on the disc and a version on the air, and they were different. Season 5 also saw the first significant escalation of what would become one of the show's most controversial long-running dynamics, the treatment of Meg Griffin. In the early seasons, Meg was simply the uncool teenage daughter. She was a target for mild social humiliation. By season 5, the cruelty directed at her character had begun to move beyond gentle mockery into something more systematic. Some of the scenes in the DVD releases from this period show even more extreme versions of the family's dismissal of Meg than what aired on Fox. The broadcast versions were already uncomfortable for some viewers. The uncut versions were more so. This escalation of the content involving Meg's treatment was not censored in the traditional sense. It was not subject to FCC review or regulatory pressure. It was an internal creative decision about how far to push a specific kind of humor. And in the DVD releases, those decisions were presented to the audience without the friction of a review process. What you see on the DVD from this period is not the version that survived censorship. It is the version that survived only the writer's own judgment about what was funny. The question of whose judgment governed what was acceptable in the later seasons, after MacFarlane stepped back from active daily creative involvement around 2011, is a large and important one that shapes much of the material from the show's middle and later periods. When the creator of a show is in the room, there's a certain check on the creative extremes that new writers might otherwise reach. Not because the creator is inherently more conservative, but because they have a longer relationship with the characters and a more developed sense of what is consistent with who those characters are. As that check diminished, some of the material in both the broadcast and the DVD releases became more disconnected from the emotional logic of the early show. The most significant event of the 6th and 7th seasons from a content history perspective was the Writers Guild of America strike that began in November of 2007. MacFarlane joined the picket lines in full solidarity with the writers, and the strike effectively paused the show's production for about 3 months. 3 episodes that had already been completed before the strike began were aired by Fox during the strike period, a decision that MacFarlane was not pleased with. The network had the legal right to broadcast already completed episodes, but airing them while their creator was on strike felt to MacFarlane like a breach of the spirit of his relationship with the network. Those 3 episodes, which aired between November 2007 and February 2008, while the strike was ongoing, exist in a particular historical context. They are episodes that Fox chose to air specifically because they were already in the can, and because the network wanted to maintain some programming continuity. They were not episodes that were supposed to air then, in that specific moment, and MacFarlane's anger about their airing was public and documented. After the strike ended in February 2008 with the writers securing better terms for compensation from digital and DVD distribution, Family Guy resumed its regular production schedule. But the strike had interrupted something that is difficult to quantify but easy to feel when you watch the seasons around that period. The creative rhythm had been broken. Writers who had been building momentum on specific story arcs had lost that momentum. New material had to be developed quickly to fill the gap. And the stricter post-Janet Jackson regulatory environment was still in effect. The combination of these factors produced, in the 7th and 8th seasons, some of the most uneven material in the show's history and some of the most interesting censorship stories. It was during this period that the show began developing its most ambitious controversial episode, the one that would ultimately never air on American television at all. Section 6. The Brian and Stewie Vault. Their Hidden Moments. There is no relationship in Family Guy's history that has generated more unaired material, more deleted scenes, more extended DVD content, and more pure creative energy than the friendship between Brian Griffin and Stewie Griffin. In the original conception of the show, Brian was primarily Peter's sidekick. He was the voice of reason in Peter's life, the grounded, sarcastic counterpoint to Peter's chaos. Stewie, in those first episodes, was a loner. He talked to the camera more than he talked to the other characters. His relationships were with his weapons and his schemes and his long-term project of either murdering his mother or conquering the planet. Brian and Stewie existed in largely separate comedic lanes. Road to Rhode Island, the 13th episode of Season 2, changed this. Written by Gary Janetti, the episode paired Brian and Stewie together for a cross-country journey and discovered, through the process of actually writing and recording and animating those two characters, sharing extended screen time, that the chemistry between them was extraordinary. The show's creator and the show's director, Dan Povenmire, both described the episode as a creative revelation. MacFarlane himself has called it his favorite episode of the entire series. What the episode revealed was that Brian and Stewie spoke to each other across the age gap between them in a way that was both funny and genuinely moving. Brian's world weariness and Stewie's precocious menace created a dynamic that neither character could achieve alone. The episode ends with them riding in an open boxcar, singing a duet, their relationship established as one of the show's emotional anchors. From that point forward, the Road to episodes, the adventures that Brian and Stewie went on together every few seasons, became some of the most eagerly anticipated content the show produced. And alongside the broadcast versions of those episodes, there existed a parallel archive of scenes that were written for Brian and Stewie but never reached the air in their original form. The 8th season episode, Brian and Stewie, is one of the most frequently cited examples of the show at its best. The episode runs for a full 22 minutes without a single cutaway gag. It consists entirely of Brian and Stewie, locked in a bank vault overnight, talking to each other. In the course of that conversation, Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has, in darker moments, considered ending his own life. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian in a way that the character had never expressed before and would never quite express again. The episode is remarkable not just for its content, but for what it suggests about what the show was capable of when it chose to set aside its signature comedy format entirely and simply write two characters having a real conversation. The DVD commentary for the episode is extraordinary listening. The writers and producers talk about the episode with a particular kind of pride, a sense that they made something that mattered, that was real, that did not need the jokes. But even this episode, which by most accounts represents the show's most undiluted creative ambition, had content that was reviewed and modified before broadcast. The specifics of what Brian's suicidal thoughts involved, and certain lines of dialogue in the sequence where Stewie addresses Brian's emotional state, were subject to review. Some of the most direct and emotionally naked lines in the exchange were softened from their original versions. The DVD release includes an extended cut with some of the trimmed material restored, and listening to the additional dialogue is a different experience from watching the broadcast version. The broadcast version is extraordinary. The DVD version is more raw. There is a specific dynamic at work in the Brian and Stewie deleted material that is worth examining closely. The two characters represented the show's capacity for genuine emotional depth, and the censorship of their scenes was often less about regulatory concern and more about the network's discomfort with the emotional weight of what they were saying. A scene that involves Stewie expressing absolute devotion to Brian, or Brian expressing despair about his life, operates at a register that is genuinely uncomfortable in a different way than a crude joke. The discomfort is not offense. It is proximity to something true. The 9th season episode, Brian Writes a Bestseller, in which Brian's self-help book becomes a massive commercial success, and he promptly treats Stewie with contempt, contains DVD material that extends several of the scenes in ways that make Brian's behavior even more explicitly cruel than what aired. The broadcast version shows Brian at his most arrogant and ungrateful. The extended DVD version shows that arrogance turning into something that is harder to watch. A specific kind of contempt for someone who was vulnerable enough to believe in you. The contrast between the Stewie who loved Brian and Stewie And the Brian who treated Stewie with contempt in Brian Writes a Bestseller represents one of the more jarring character discontinuities in the show's later run. And both versions of both of those episodes, the broadcast and the DVD, contain different proportions of the same conflict. The broadcast version softens the extremes. The DVD version does not. The series of Road to episodes that aired across the show's middle and later seasons each had their own bodies of cut material. Road to the Multiverse in the ninth season contained an extended sequence exploring an alternate universe version of the show that was significantly longer than what aired and included several realities that were deemed too dark or too explicit for the Fox broadcast. The episode as it aired was already one of the more ambitious things the show had done. The full version was more so. Road to Germany from the eighth season, in which Stewie, Brian, and Mort Goldman travel back in time to Nazi Germany, generated internal discussion during production about several specific scenes involving the depiction of the Third Reich and its atrocities. The show's approach to historical events, including genocide, was always a delicate negotiation between the satirical intent and the possibility of offense. Some of the scenes in the original cut of that episode were modified before broadcast to ensure that the show's dark humor registered as critique rather than as normalization of what it was depicting. The DVD version contains some of the original material, though the differences in this case are more subtle than in other episodes. The Brian and Stewie relationship also generated a particular kind of deleted material that does not appear on any official DVD release, and that exists primarily in the commentary tracks and anecdotal accounts of people who worked on the show. These are the scenes that were written in the room, read at table reads, laughed at, or debated, and then quietly not advanced to the animation stage. These are the oldest and least recoverable kind of deleted scene. They live only in memory. The table reads that Steve Callahan, one of the show's executive producers, described in interviews as a crucial part of the production process, were where much of this material lived and died. Writers would pitch scenes aloud, sometimes performing the dialogue themselves, sometimes in character, sometimes breaking into song. The reactions from people in the room, including production staff, other writers, and occasional guests, brought in to provide an outside perspective, shaped which material advanced. The scenes that did not advance became the unarchived archive, the record that exists only in the minds of the people who were in those rooms. MacFarlane's own description of the writing process in his 2007 interview with The Great Reporter touched on this dynamic. He noted that about half of the material that sounds improvised in the final product was actually scripted and then delivered to sound improvised. The writers who voiced characters they had written were allowed to bring their own inflections and timing to the lines. This created a process that was more organic and more unpredictable than a standard animation production, and it produced, alongside the material that made it into the episodes, a large amount of material that existed only in that organic process. The Stewie character in particular generated a vast amount of material that was written, recorded, and then judged as too extreme, too uncomfortable, or simply too long for the final cut. Stewie's voice, which MacFarlane described as being inspired by the English actor Rex Harrison, and specifically by Harrison's performance in the 1964 film My Fair Lady, gave the character a particular quality that made extreme statements sound charming and almost musical. The dissonance between the voice and the content it delivered was one of the foundations of the character's humor. But that dissonance also meant that material delivered in Stewie's voice could read as more extreme than the same material would read in a different register, because the cheerful musicality of the delivery drew attention to the darkness of what was being said. Some of the most memorable unaired Stewie moments are the ones that existed in the show's early seasons, before his character transformation toward the softer, more emotionally accessible version of himself that emerged in the fourth season and beyond. The original Stewie, with his plots for world domination and his ongoing campaign to kill Lois, generated material in the first 3 seasons that was sometimes pulled from the final cut, because the writers felt the joke had gone on long enough, or that a specific device was too elaborate, or that a particular target was better left undepicted. Many of these cuts were made not by Fox's Standards and Practices department, but by MacFarlane's own judgment about what was funny. Some of the most extreme early Stewie material was cut not because someone outside the production told them to cut it, but because McFarlane looked at it and decided it did not earn what it was asking of the audience. That is a different kind of cut than the regulatory kind. It is the cut made by a craftsman who knows when a joke has gone far enough. And it produced a shadow archive not of material that was suppressed, but of material that its own creator thought was too much. Section 7. Peter Griffin's most unhinged, unaired moments. If the Brian and Stewie archive is defined by emotional depth and the suppression of genuine feeling, the Peter Griffin archive is defined by something more physically extreme. Peter's character, in the early seasons, generated cuts primarily because the show was finding the boundaries of what you could do with a lovable idiot who made bad decisions. In the later seasons, the cuts involving Peter became more significant because the character himself had become harder to contain. The transformation of Peter Griffin from the warm, bumbling father of seasons 1 through 3 into the increasingly extreme figure of the later seasons is well documented by critics and fans. What is less documented is the material that was written for the later seasons that went even further than what aired. The versions of Peter that the network said were too much, even for a show that had already pushed well past most broadcast standards. The episode Baby It's Cold Inside contains a moment in which Peter shoves Lois into the water to protect himself from what he believes is an approaching shark. The broadcast version of this moment is already significant because it shows Peter genuinely endangering his wife without hesitation. The DVD version, which is only marginally different from the broadcast, clarifies several details of the exchange that the broadcast version leaves ambiguous. The additional dialogue makes Peter's thought process more explicit and, in doing so, makes his selfishness more premeditated rather than more instinctive. The episode Musts and Dogs from the later seasons, in which Peter steals Stewie's Halloween candy, had an extended scene on the DVD release that showed Peter's justification for the theft in detail. The broadcast version treated the event as a quick guy. The extended version gave Peter a logic for his behavior that was more developed and, in its development, more clearly monstrous. The physical comedy involving Peter across the later seasons generated an entire category of material that was reviewed specifically for its graphic nature. The show had always used cartoon violence as a comedy tool, but the level of detail in the depictions of injury began escalating in the 8th season and beyond. Fox's standards and practices reviews of these episodes sometimes resulted in specific frames being removed or specific sound effects being altered to make the depictions less visceral. The broadcast versions of some of the late-season Peter injury gags are already quite graphic. The original cuts, in a small number of cases, were more so. The giant chicken fight sequences, which recur throughout the show's run, and involve Peter in extended, elaborately animated brawls with a character called Ernie the Giant Chicken, had their own complicated relationship with content review. The original fights in the early seasons were cartoon violence, stylized and quick. As the show's animation technology improved and the fights became more elaborate, the level of detail in the depictions also increased. Some of the chicken fight content from the later seasons went through multiple rounds of review before reaching a version that Fox would broadcast. The 8th season episode, Jerome is the New Black, is most famous for containing Quagmire's extended speech about everything he dislikes about Brian. But the episode also has a subplot involving Peter that had material in the original cut which was modified before broadcast. The specific nature of these modifications is not fully documented in the DVD commentary, but the episode's DVD release is slightly longer than the broadcast version and includes several additional beats in the Peter storyline that Fox had flagged during review. The 10th season episode Seahorse Seashell Party is one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history, because of what happens when Meg finally confronts her family about their treatment of her. In the original cut of the episode, Peter's response to Meg's speech was even more dismissive than what aired. The broadcast version shows Peter laughing off Meg's accusations. The original version, according to people who reviewed the production materials, had Peter going further in his dismissal in ways that the network felt crossed a line even for this episode. There is something complicated about that particular cut. Seahorse Seashell Party is an episode that ends with Meg voluntarily returning to her role as the family's scapegoat, and the final message of the episode is deeply troubling if you engage with it honestly. The network's decision to soften one specific element of Peter's behavior in an episode that is, by any analysis, about the validation of abuse as a family system is a strange kind of line to draw. It says something about the limits of network content review, which can identify specific moments of explicit content but cannot assess the larger implications of what a story is saying. The later Peter material from seasons 12 onward exists in a context where the show had largely abandoned the structure of having consequences follow actions. In the early seasons, Peter would do something foolish or harmful. The episode would follow the consequences, and Peter would usually arrive at some acknowledgement that he had been wrong. In the later seasons, this structure often dissolved. Peter would do something, the episode would end, and the next episode would begin as if the previous episode had not happened. This reset button storytelling created a specific kind of content situation. Because there were no lasting consequences, the actions could keep escalating without the show having to address what those actions meant. The DVD releases from the later seasons sometimes contain extended versions of scenes that show even more clearly how the reset button worked, with Peter saying or doing something that in an earlier season would have required an entire episode's worth of resolution, and the extended DVD material simply providing more of the same action without addressing the implications. The most explicit example of this pattern, and the one that generated the most discussion both inside and outside the production, was the material from the seasons after Brian's death and revival in season 12. In the episode Life of Brian, Brian is struck by a car and dies. The episode treats his death as a real emotional event. The family mourns. Stewie is devastated. A new dog named Vinny is introduced. And then, 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie uses time travel to prevent Brian's death, and Brian comes back to life as if nothing had happened. The original versions of both episodes, as documented through the DVD releases and the commentary tracks, are not substantially different from what aired. The decision to kill Brian and then almost immediately undo his death was a creative choice made by the production team, and the network's role in it was primarily about managing the public relations implications of such a dramatic story development. The angry fan response to Brian's death, which was reported as national news and trended on social media, and the subsequent revelation that his death would be reversed, generated more external attention than any other story development in the show's history. What the extended DVD material for these episodes reveals is something about the writing room's own ambivalence about the decision. There are moments in the extended cuts where the grief around Brian's death is rendered with more detail and more sincerity than the broadcast versions allow. The additional material does not change the fact that the death is reversed, but it suggests that the people who made the episodes were more committed to the emotional reality of Brian's absence than the speed of his return might indicate. Peter Griffin's unaired material, in aggregate, is the story of a character whose potential for harmful behavior outpaced the show's willingness to follow that behavior to its logical conclusions. The network pulled back from some of the most extreme versions of Peter's actions. The show's own reset mechanism pulled back from the consequences. The result was a character who existed in a kind of suspended extremity, capable of anything but accountable for nothing, and the archive of what was cut from that character's story is both a record of the censorship that applied to him and a record of the consequences that never came. Section 8. The supporting cast's hidden stories. While Peter, Brian, and Stewie generated the most high-profile content battles, the show's supporting cast produced their own bodies of unaired material that tell a different set of stories about what the show was attempting and what it was prevented from doing. Glenn Quagmire, voiced by Seth MacFarlane in a warm, period-appropriate swagger, was from his first appearance one of the show's most complicated supporting characters. He was introduced as the neighborhood sex addict, a character whose entire personality was organized around his appetite for women and his cheerful disregard for conventional morality. In the early seasons, Quagmire's transgressions were played as low-level cartoon mischief. He was a lech, but a cartoonish one. The show treated his behavior the way the era's comedy generally treated his type, as fundamentally harmless because his targets were not real people and the context was clearly satirical. As the seasons continued, the show's relationship with Quagmire's character became more complex and, in the context of changing cultural conversations about consent and coercion, more difficult to navigate. Some of the material written for Quagmire in the later seasons was modified or removed specifically because the show was aware that the cultural context for jokes about his behavior had shifted significantly. The DVD commentary for the early Quagmire episodes contains several candid discussions about how far the writers felt comfortable going with the characters' antics. In those early seasons, the line being drawn was primarily about specificity, about whether what Quagmire was doing was abstract enough to remain funny without becoming something that read as the show endorsing his behavior. The material that was cut from early Quagmire scenes was typically cut because it crossed from abstraction into specificity in ways that made the endorsement problem more visible. Cleveland Brown, voiced by Mike Henry until Henry departed the role in 2020, citing concerns about black characters being voiced by non-black actors, was the member of Peter's friend group whose character generated the least overtly censored content. Cleveland was generally written as the more grounded and reasonable member of the group, and his departures from reason tended to be funnier in their understatement than the louder behavior of Peter and Quagmire. The DVD material for the seasons when Cleveland was a regular character before his departure to the Cleveland Show spinoff in 2009 shows a version of the character that was, in several episodes, written with considerably more emotional depth than what made it to broadcast. Some of the scenes between Cleveland and Peter, in which the two friends confronted the dynamics of their relationship with more honesty than the show usually permitted, were trimmed for time or tonal consistency before broadcast. The extended DVD versions of these scenes are among the more moving material in the show's secondary archive. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who was one of Peter's closest friends, had perhaps the most consistent and most clearly documented experience of having his character's material modified between the production stage and the broadcast. Joe was introduced in Season 1 as a capable, respected figure who happened to use a wheelchair. His disability was presented as one aspect of a complex and admirable character. Over the course of the show's run, the treatment of Joe's disability shifted from characterization to punchline, and this shift produced both internal debate within the production team and external censorship pressure. Some of the later season material involving Joe contained jokes specifically about his wheelchair use and his physical limitations that Fox's Standards and Practices Department flagged as potentially problematic under the Americans with Disabilities Act and under the network's own guidelines about the depiction of disabled characters. The specific ways in which these scenes were modified are documented in several DVD commentaries, which note that lines were changed on, situations were reframed, and in at least one episode, an extended sequence involving Joe's physical limitations was significantly shortened before broadcast. Meg Griffin's hidden material occupies a category of its own. Her story is explored in detail elsewhere in this script, but in the context of the supporting cast's broader archive, it is worth noting that Meg's unaired content tends to be different in character from most of the other cut material. The majority of what was removed from Meg's scenes across the show's run was not material that was too extreme or too dark. It was material that was too sympathetic, too much, in the judgment of whoever was making the decision, in the direction of treating Meg as a fully realized character whose suffering mattered. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13, The Simpsons Guy, contains an extended scene in which Meg meets Lisa Simpson that is longer in the DVD version than in the broadcast. The additional material gives the two characters more time to connect, to recognize in each other a shared experience of being the thoughtful, underestimated female member of a chaotic family, and to find genuine friendship in that recognition. The scene is one of the more quietly beautiful things the show produced in its later seasons, and the broadcast version is already good. The DVD version is better, and the decision to trim it for broadcast, to take time away from two characters discovering each other, is one of the more humanly costly cuts in the show's later archive. Neil Goldman, the recurring character whose name was taken from one of the show's actual writers as an inside joke, generated content in several episodes that was modified before broadcast specifically because of the show's portrayal of his romantic obsession with Meg. In the early seasons, Neil's crush on Meg was played as a somewhat more balanced situation. In the later seasons, as the show's treatment of Meg became more extreme, Neil's devotion was written in ways that some reviewers felt crossed into territory that the show was not equipped to handle with the sensitivity it required. Some of the extended DVD material from the Neil and Meg storylines in the middle seasons is notable for how uncomfortable it is. Not because it is graphic, but because it sits at the intersection of the show's casual cruelty toward Meg and the character of a person who genuinely cares about her. Herbert the pedophile, the elderly character whose name signals exactly what his characterization entailed, generated the most consistently flagged content of any recurring character in the show's history. The character was always a dark joke, the humor residing in the juxtaposition of his clearly stated proclivities, and the show's refusal to allow those proclivities to result in any actual harm to any actual child. But the network's review of Herbert's material was intense and ongoing, and the DVD releases contain a significant body of material involving Herbert that was modified or removed from broadcast. The most documented example of this is from the Season 5 episode Petergeist, a parody of the 1982 film Poltergeist. A scene that was cut for both time and standards and practices reasons had Herbert and a tree monster climbing out of a hole after the Griffin house disappears, with Herbert asking the tree whether it was a giving tree or a receiving tree. The wordplay on a famous children's book title and its more explicit secondary meaning was deemed too much for the broadcast version. The scene is documented in the DVD commentary track, where the cut is discussed with a mixture of mild regret and understanding that it was probably the right call. The supporting cast's archive as a whole reflects something about the nature of ensemble comedy and what it means to have recurring characters whose entire identity is organized around a single, fixed trait. When a character's trait is relatively benign, like Cleveland's even-handedness or Joe's police work, the archive of their unaired material tends to be about extended scenes that were cut for time or pacing. When a character's trait is more extreme, like Herbert's, the archive tends to be about specific content that crossed lines the network had set. And when a character's trait is something the show itself was never sure how to handle, like Meg's victimhood, the archive tends to be about the material the show could not commit to showing. Honestly. Section 9. Table reads, deleted dialogues, and the voice actors. The recording studio where Family Guy's voice cast assembled each week is a space that has generated its own mythology among fans of the show. The principal cast, Seth MacFarlane voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, Alex Borstein voicing Lois, Seth Green voicing Chris, and Mila Kunis voicing Meg, with Mike Henry voicing Cleveland and numerous other characters, formed a working unit that was remarkably stable over more than 2 decades of production. What happens in a voice recording session for an animated show is not precisely what casual fans imagine. The actors do not necessarily record together in the same booth at the same time. In Family Guy's case, the recording process typically involved the cast recording their lines in sessions that were organized by scene and character, with some degree of overlap, but also significant solo work. MacFarlane, who voices 4 of the show's main characters, would sometimes spend extended sessions alone in the booth, working through his character's material. The table reads, however, were a different experience. Steve Callahan, the show's executive producer, described them in detail in a Clear Voice interview, noting that they brought in people from outside the office to provide fresh perspective on whether the material was landing. The goal, as Callahan described it, was to ensure the show was funny for as many people as possible. The table reads served as a kind of triage for the scripts, identifying material that consistently got laughs and material that consistently did not. MacFarlane's own description of the table read process across various interviews touched on the energy of having a room full of people who found the scripts genuinely funny. He noted that the writing staff at Family Guy had a performance background, meaning that they would actually perform their pitches, singing and acting out the scenes they were proposing. This gave the table reads an energy that was different from a simple reading of a script. But the table reads also produced something less visible: the experience of hearing a scene fall flat. When a joke does not land at a table read, when the room does not laugh or laughs in the wrong way, or goes quiet in a way that communicates discomfort rather than amusement, the material is usually not advanced further. It does not get animated. It does not get recorded by the voice cast. It simply stops. These scenes that died at table reads represent the largest and least recoverable portion of the show's shadow archive. There is no document trail for them. There are no DVD extras preserving them. They exist only in the memory of the writers, directors, and production staff who were in the room on whatever day the reading happened. Scenes involving Stewie that went too far in their darkness. Scenes involving Peter that nobody found funny. Scenes involving the supporting characters that were fully imagined in the writing, but dissolved in the performance. The voice actor's own contributions to the show's content history are documented in scattered ways across interviews, DVD commentaries, and the occasional panel discussion at conventions. McFarlane's description of his recording process, in which he described being sometimes forced into the booth by the production schedule even when he was sick or exhausted, gives a sense of the physical and creative demands of voicing four distinct characters across a season of more than 20 episodes. Alex Borstein, who won an Emmy for her work on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and whose profile rose significantly in the later years of Family Guy's run, has spoken about the evolution of Lois's voice over the decades. The character's voice is physically demanding, sitting in a register that is not Borstein's natural speaking voice, and the consistency of that voice across more than 20 years of production is a technical achievement that gets less attention than the character writing it supports. Mila Kunis has discussed the experience of voicing Meg through the years of the character's most extreme abuse, noting in interviews that people would approach her and quote the dismissive catchphrase that became associated with the character's treatment, directing it at her in person. The line in which Peter dismisses Meg with a word and then physically indicates he wants her out of the scene became such a widely recognized cultural shorthand for casual cruelty that it detached from its fictional context and entered everyday speech. Kunis's description of that experience, of having the fictional cruelty of a cartoon aimed at the real person who gave the cartoon its voice, is one of the more quietly disturbing accounts of the show's impact on its own creators. Seth Green, whose voice for Chris was based on the Buffalo Bill character from The Silence of the Lambs, filtered through the register of an 11-year-old, has mentioned in various interviews that the recording sessions for Chris were often short relative to the other main characters, simply because Chris had less substantial material to deliver in most episodes. This brevity in the recording sessions reflected the character's diminished role in the later seasons, and the archive of deleted or extended Chris material from the later period is correspondingly thin. The most substantive account of what happened in the recording booth that did not make it to air comes from the DVD commentaries, where cast and crew would sometimes discuss alternatives that had been recorded but not used. In the commentary for Brian and Stewie, which was one of the most extensively discussed episodes in the commentary track tradition, McFarlane discussed alternatives for the episode's most emotionally raw moments. Scenes where he felt the writing was going in a direction that was either too explicit or not explicit enough, and how those alternatives were navigated in the recording process. The recording of the voice performances also generated what are colloquially known in animation as scratch takes, preliminary recordings made for reference during the animation process that are sometimes more spontaneous and less polished than the final takes. These scratch recordings occasionally captured performances or line interpretations that were later judged to be better than the finished takes. In a small number of cases, content from scratch takes that was not intended for the Ironwood episode ended up influencing the animation or appearing in test screenings before being replaced. The test screenings themselves were a source of feedback that shaped the content of episodes before they were finalized. Animated shows typically go through multiple rounds of review between the production of a rough cut and the delivery of a final broadcast master. In each round of review, content that is not working, or content that raises concerns, can be flagged and addressed. The test screening process for Family Guy, while less documented than the table read process, contributed its own revisions to the archive of what did not make the air. There is a particular story, documented in a 2007 interview with McFarlane, that captures something of the texture of these processes. A joke in a Family Guy episode referenced what McFarlane described as a very inside reference to the fact that certain work was being done on the show before the writer's strike of 2007 was over. The joke was a direct creative expression of frustration, a message from the writers to anyone who knew enough about the behind-the-scenes situation to understand it. McFarlane noted that the person who was the subject of the critique called after the episode aired and was angry. The call, McFarlane said, lasted an hour. This is not a story about censorship in the conventional sense. Nobody cut the joke before it aired, but it is a story about the show's relationship between its public face and its private frustrations, and about how that relationship could sometimes leak onto the screen in ways that had consequences. The archive of Family Guy is not only the archive of what was removed before broadcast. It is also the archive of what made it to broadcast and then rippled outward in ways that the production had not fully anticipated. Section 10. Network battles, standards and practices, and the content that was literally illegal to air. Every word that airs on American broadcast television is subject to a regulatory framework that is more complex and more historically specific than most viewers realize. The Federal Communications Commission's authority over broadcast content does not extend to cable or streaming services, which is why shows on HBO or Netflix can contain content that would be impossible on NBC or Fox. But for Family Guy, which aired on a broadcast network subject to FCC oversight, the regulatory framework was a constant presence in the production process. The key legal distinction in FCC regulation is between content that is obscene, which cannot be broadcast at any time of day, and content that is indecent, which can be broadcast only between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Family Guy aired in prime time between 8 and 9 p.m., which meant that it was subject to the indecency standard, not the obscenity standard, but was not in the safe harbor window where the indecency standard does not apply. The FCC's definition of indecent content is, in formal terms, material that describes or depicts sexual or excretory organs or activities in a patently offensive manner. The word patently offensive is a significant one because it introduces a subjective element that makes the application of the standard case-specific and context-dependent. The same content might be patently offensive in one context and acceptable in another, depending on how it relates to the editorial purpose of the surrounding material. This definitional flexibility was one of the reasons that the negotiations between Family Guy's production team and Fox's Standards and Practices Department were as ongoing and as detailed as they were. The show was constantly testing what the standard required in specific contexts, and the network's internal censors were constantly making judgments about where the line sat. Those judgments were sometimes conservative, sometimes more permissive than might have been expected, and occasionally specific enough to feel almost arbitrary. The most significant formal test of the show's relationship with broadcast regulation came not through a content decision but through a news event. On April 15, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds of others. About a month earlier, on March 17, 2013, Family Guy had aired an episode called Turban Cowboy, which contained 2 separate scenes that, when edited together out of context, appeared to depict the same kind of attack. In the actual episode, Peter wins the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the runners, and in a separate, completely unrelated storyline in the same episode, Peter unknowingly acquires a cell phone that, when dialed, detonates terrorist explosives. These 2 storylines had nothing to do with each other within the episode's narrative. But an edited video that circulated online shortly after the bombing spliced the 2 scenes together to make it appear that the episode had predicted or even inspired the attack. Fox moved quickly. The network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com and from the streaming platform Hulu. They stated that they had no plans to rebroadcast the episode. McFarlane, on social media, called the edited video abhorrent and expressed his sympathy for the victims of the bombing. The spliced video was widely understood by anyone who had actually watched the original episode to be deliberately misleading, a bad faith manipulation of 2 separate scenes to imply a connection that did not exist. But the public attention and the association between the episode and the real-world tragedy made it impossible for Fox to continue airing the episode in the immediate aftermath. The episode was gone from American streaming for 9 years. It did not return to Hulu until September of 2022. During those 9 years, it remained the most visible example since the Bin Laden scene in Road to Rhode Island of a Family Guy episode being removed from circulation, not because of its content in isolation, but because of the relationship between that content and a real-world event. It is worth pausing on the specific nature of that relationship. The Boston Marathon bombing was not predicted by Family Guy. The show's writers had no advanced knowledge of the attack. The cartoon's depiction of violence at the Boston Marathon was a dark joke about Peter doing something reckless and destructive, exactly the kind of cartoon violence the show had always included. The attack happened to occur in a context that made the earlier joke impossible to separate from the grief of the real event. This is not a censorship story in the sense of a network making a content decision about what was appropriate to broadcast. It is a story about what happens when humor and horror occupy the same physical space. The 200-year history of American satire is filled with examples of jokes that were no longer jokes after something happened. The Bin Laden airport scene is one such example. The Boston Marathon race scene is another. These scenes are frozen in time in the moment before the thing happened, and that changed what they meant. Their removal from circulation is not an act of censorship in the political sense. It is an act of human recognition that some things cannot be laughed at anymore because the laughter would land in the wrong place. The episode that was never allowed to air at all, the one that stands alone in the show's history as the only episode that was produced, approved for production, and then simply refused, is Partial Terms of Endearment. Its story was briefly introduced earlier in this journey, but it deserves the fuller treatment it has waited patiently for. The episode was conceived in the show's writer's room and assigned to writer Danny Smith. MacFarlane, before Smith began writing the script, asked him to read a specific essay from scientist Carl Sagan's book Billions and Billions. The essay, which Sagan co-authored with his wife Anne Druyan, was titled "Abortion, Is It Possible to Be Both Pro-Life and Pro-Choice?" Sagan's approach to the subject was to examine the biological and ethical questions about when human life begins with the same rigor he would apply to a scientific question, arriving at a nuanced position that acknowledged the genuine moral complexity of the debate. MacFarlane's decision to base a Family Guy episode on Carl Sagan's abortion essay says something about his ambitions for the show at its most serious. This was not a show trying to shock with crude content. This was a show trying to do what the best satire does: engage with a genuinely difficult subject matter with intelligence, care, and a commitment to not taking the easy way out. The episode that Smith produced follows Lois as she agrees to serve as a surrogate mother for her college friend Naomi and Naomi's husband Dale. After Naomi and Dale die in a car accident, Lois is left with a decision about the pregnancy. Peter, who was initially opposed to the surrogacy, is radicalized by an anti-abortion activist and his position shifts. Lois, after genuinely wrestling with the decision, chooses to have an abortion. In the final scene, she begins to announce to the family that she has news about the pregnancy, and then Peter turns to the camera and says simply, "We had the abortion," before the episode ends abruptly. The episode was produced and completed. It was submitted to the network. Fox Broadcasting exercised their contractual right not to air it, and they extended that exercise of authority by requesting that Adult Swim, which had previously aired content that Fox was uncomfortable with, also honor their wishes and not broadcast the episode. Kevin Riley, then Fox's entertainment president, was notably candid in discussing the decision. He did not say the episode was badly made. He did not say it violated FCC guidelines, because it did not. He said the subject matter was fragile, and he framed the decision in explicitly financial terms, noting that it was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time. The network was concerned that airing an episode that took a clear position on abortion would generate enough advertiser pressure to affect the show's revenue. MacFarlane disagreed with the decision and said so publicly. He described the episode's ban as being rooted in people's inability to handle and dissect controversial narratives. He noted in his New York Times blog interview that the show had dealt with similarly sensitive material before and that part of the resistance was simply the word abortion itself, a word that he described as a comedy red zone for many people, a phrase you were simply not supposed to say. The episode aired in the United Kingdom in 2010, where the BBC was happy to broadcast it in its usual primetime slot. It reached nearly 1 million homes in the UK. The reviews were largely positive, with critics praising both the writing and the show's willingness to take a clear position, rather than offering a non-resolution ending that would satisfy neither side of the debate. The comparison to what was happening in American television, where the same subject matter remained essentially untouchable, was made explicitly by several critics. Partial Terms of Endearment was released on DVD in the United States on September 28, 2010. It is available on that VD and on certain streaming platforms outside the United States. As of the time this script was written, it has never aired on American television, and it is the only episode in the show's history that can make that claim. The most quietly subversive element of the episode is the ending. Peter's direct address to camera, "We had the abortion," is a joke, but it is also something more than a joke. It is an acknowledgement that the show has been operating in a space where the audience knows it is watching a work of fiction, and that the show's creators have made a choice to use that fiction to say something specific about a real debate. The abruptness of the ending, the way it cuts off Lois's announcement with Peter's three words and then simply stops, is not cowardice. It is commitment. They made the decision, they said it out loud, and they ended. The fact that American television has never been allowed to see that ending tells you something about where the real limits of free expression sit in American broadcast culture. The FCC did not ban the episode. The network banned it. And the network banned it not because of what the episode contained in terms of graphic content, because it contained less graphic content than many episodes that aired without incident, but because of what it said. Section 11. The DVD uncut versions. Everything they added back. The history of the Family Guy DVD releases is, in many ways, a parallel history of the show itself. While the broadcast version was the version that millions of people saw on Sunday nights, the DVD version was the version that the production team had actually made, or at least a closer approximation of it. The relationship between the two versions changed significantly across the show's run. In the first 3 seasons, the DVD releases were primarily about making the episodes available on physical media for the growing audience that had discovered the show through Adult Swim reruns. The differences between the broadcast and DVD versions of these early episodes were relatively minor, consisting mainly of the uncensored audio for bleeps and the occasional brief scene that had been cut from the broadcast for time. From the 4th season onward, the DVD releases began including more substantial differences. The uncensored versions of episodes were longer, sometimes significantly so, and included not just restored audio but entire scenes that had not appeared in any broadcast version. The Deep Throats episode in Season 4 is a clear example of this shift. The broadcast version had Peter and Lois redrawn with underwear and Lois's more explicit line removed. The DVD version restored both the nudity and the dialogue, making the scene function as it was written. The PTV episode presented a particularly interesting case study in what the DVD could contain. The broadcast version substituted the douchebag's jackass parody with a different sequence involving Peter's side boob hour. The DVD version included douchebags in its full glory, with Peter engaged in a gross-out stunt over a highway overpass that concluded with his waist hitting Lois's car. The sequence is not subtle. It is exactly the kind of content that Fox's Standards and Practices Review had determined could not air before 10 p.m. But on the DVD, with its different content environment and its direct-to-consumer commercial relationship, the sequence existed without the friction of the broadcast review process. The Season 5 DVD release included restored versions of several scenes from the Barely Legal episode that were trimmed in the broadcast. The extended version of Meg's captivity of Brian is notably more uncomfortable than what aired, with additional dialogue that makes the power dynamic in the scene more explicitly unsettling. The broadcast version was already unusual for a primetime animated comedy. The full version was more so, and the discomfort it generated was not the discomfort of shock for its own sake, but of a show going somewhere dark with intention. The petarded DVD included a written description in the commentary tracks of the Peter is Slow musical number that was cut, along with discussion of why the decision to cut the whole sequence rather than modify it was made. The actual musical number itself was not included as a bonus feature, because the decision had been made early in the post-production process, and the sequence had not been fully animated. Its absence from the DVD is thus a record of a decision made before the material existed in a recoverable form. Season 6 brought the 2-part Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie episodes, which the DVD release presented with slight extensions to several scenes involving the simulation reveal. The broadcast version of the twist, in which the entire second episode is revealed to have been a computer simulation running on Stewie's laptop, is already a somewhat unsatisfying resolution to the dramatic stakes of the first episode. The DVD version includes a longer version of the reveal sequence that gives the characters a slightly longer moment to process what has happened before everything resets. The additional time does not change the nature of the twist, but it changes the feeling of it. The DVD releases from the later seasons, from Season 8 onward, tend to have more extended sequences and fewer complete restorations of wholly different scenes than the mid-series releases. This reflects the fact that the show's relationship with its own censorship had evolved. By the later seasons, the writers and the network's review team had developed a working understanding of what would be acceptable, and fewer scenes were being produced in a version that was substantially different from what would air. The gaps between the broadcast and DVD versions were, in most cases, smaller. The notable exception to this pattern is the material involving specific political figures and current events, which continued to generate significant differences between what aired and what appeared on DVD throughout the show's run. Jokes referencing specific politicians, specific news stories, and specific cultural controversies were particularly likely to be modified or removed in broadcast versions and restored on DVD. The show's political content, which became more prominent in the later seasons as Brian's character was increasingly used as a vehicle for the writer's own political views, was subject to a different kind of review than the content involving sex, violence, or potentially offensive language. The DVD releases also included, beginning with the fourth season, a feature that was unique to Family Guy among its animated contemporaries. Audio commentaries recorded by Seth MacFarlane in character as specific characters from the show. The Family Guy, The Freakin' Sweet Collection. DVD released in 2004 included a commentary on Road to Rhode Island, recorded with MacFarlane performing as both Brian and Stewie. This commentary, and others like it that appeared on subsequent releases, exist as a kind of creative artifact in themselves. They are MacFarlane performing his own characters in a context that is somewhere between a bonus feature and a piece of original content. The commentary tradition in general revealed things about the show's relationship with its own history that straight documentary supplements would not have captured. MacFarlane's commentary tracks were notable for their candor about what had been cut and why, about which episodes the production team was proud of and which they were less satisfied with, and about the specific negotiations that had shaped specific content decisions. One of the most revealing commentary moments from the Season 4 DVD involved a discussion of the writing staff's response to viewing the final cut of an episode that had gone through significant revisions after review. MacFarlane described the experience of watching an episode that had been changed from what was originally written, and recognizing the places where the cuts were visible, where the rhythm of a joke was off because a setup had been removed, or where a character's behavior seemed unmotivated because the scene that explained the motivation had been trimmed. He was not angry in the description, but he was precise. The lost material was legible in the finished product if you knew where to look. The DVD releases stopped including substantially different versions of episodes after the uncensored content for Season 17 and beyond was never produced in a commercial release format. After Season 17, the show was available on Hulu and streaming platforms in the broadcast version only, with no physical media release containing the uncut material. This meant that for the last several seasons of the show, the gap between the broadcast version and the version that existed in the production materials simply grew and was never addressed. The secondary archive for the recent seasons is effectively inaccessible. The end of the DVD era coincided, not coincidentally, with a broader shift in the show's audience relationship. The fans who had grown up buying the DVD sets and seeking out the uncut material were aging out of the habits that had driven those purchases. Younger viewers who encountered the show primarily through streaming platforms had no experience of there being a different version. The idea that what you could find on Hulu was not necessarily what the show had intended was not part of their relationship with the show. This generational shift in how the audience accessed the material has consequences for the show's content history going forward. The archive of what was cut is increasingly inaccessible, increasingly undocumented, and increasingly unknown to the audience that is actually watching the show. The gap between the intended and the broadcast continues to exist, but the people who know about the gap are a smaller and more historically specific group every year. Section 12. The ghost episodes that live between the lines. We are in the quiet part now. If you have made it this far, if the room around you has grown dark and still, and the world outside has faded into the background hum of wherever you are, then you have spent a considerable amount of time in the company of the space between things. The space between what was written and what aired. The space between the version that existed in a recording booth and the version that reached an audience. The space between a joke as it was imagined and a joke as it was received. Family Guy has a ghost version of itself that is longer, stranger, more honest, and in places more disturbing than the show that aired on Fox for more than 2 decades. This ghost version is not a continuous thing. It does not run in order. It exists in fragments, in DVD commentary tracks and restored DVD scenes and table read transcripts and the memories of people who were in rooms that have long since emptied. Some of these fragments are small. A line of Lois dialogue that was restored to the DVD after being removed from the broadcast. A scene of the Griffin family on a bicycle that was written for the first episode and never animated. A second of Peter's mouth moving to a lyric that the audio was replaced beneath. Some of these fragments are substantial. An entire hour of television about abortion, beautifully written and honestly resolved, that American broadcast television decided it was not ready for. 9 years of an episode's absence from streaming platforms because a real tragedy made its dark joke about violence unbroadcastable. 3 years of an episode sitting in a drawer because network executives were not sure whether a song about needing a Jewish accountant was funny or offensive or something more complicated than either. And some of these fragments are irrecoverable. The material that died at table reads and was never animated. The scenes that were written in the room and not advanced to the production stage. The lines that MacFarlane recorded in the booth as alternates and that never made it past the review stage. The full creative intentions of the first 3 seasons, which were never preserved in the secondary archive the way the later seasons were. What does it mean to spend time with the ghost version of a show you know? It means partly developing a new relationship with the version you have always known. When you know that there was a longer version of Brian and Stewie, the broadcast version does not diminish. It becomes richer because you know it was made by people who wanted to go further and were willing to go far enough that what remains on your screen is already extraordinary. When you know that Partial Terms of Endearment exists and has not aired in the United States, the show's capacity for serious engagement with serious subjects becomes real in a different way. The show that made that episode and had it refused is not quite the same show as the show you see on a Tuesday night in its current time slot. The history of censorship and content negotiation in Family Guy is not, in the end, a simple story of a brave creative team fighting a timid network. It is more complicated than that. Some of the content that was pulled should have been pulled. Some of the content that was modified was improved by the modification. Some of the scenes that were cut for time would not have improved the episodes they were removed from. The archive of what was cut is not a repository of suppressed genius. It is a repository of the complete creative process, including its mistakes and its excesses and its genuine moments of vision that were compromised by the structures they had to pass through to reach an audience. There is something worth saying about the show's creator in this context. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when Family Guy first aired. He was 30 when the revival began. He was in his 40s when he stepped back from active daily involvement with the show, and by the time the show was renewed through its 27th season, he was approaching his mid-50s. The show he made at 24 and the show that will air in 2028 and 2029 are connected by a name, a logo, and a voice cast, but the creative relationship between their creator and both of those things is different. The early archive of what was cut is largely the archive of a very young man with a very specific vision, testing the limits of what that vision could contain. The cuts from those early seasons were made in a context of genuine creative ambition and genuine institutional negotiation, and both sides of that negotiation brought something real to the table. The later archive is more complicated because the show was being made in a different context, by people who were honoring a creative legacy they had inherited rather than building one from scratch. The Bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island is, in many ways, the show's most honest artifact. It was made by a young animator who thought it was funny, in a world where it was possible to find it funny, and it became something else when the world changed. MacFarlane missed the flight about a day that would have killed him by 10 minutes. The scene he made featuring the person who organized the thing that would have killed him was removed from the show in deference to the grief of people who were not as lucky as he was. The scene exists now on specific DVD releases and specific streaming versions, accessible to people who know where to look. The world in which it was just a joke is gone. The joke remains. That is what the archive of the unaired version of Family Guy is, ultimately. It is the record of a show that was always trying to be in several places at once. Funny and serious, shocking and warm, subversive and commercial. What was cut, what was banned, what was modified, what was held back for years and finally allowed to exist, all of that is the shape of those contradictions. The show's shadow is the size of its ambitions. The episodes that never aired in the United States exist. They are sitting in various places on DVDs and hard drives and filing cabinets, and the memories of everyone who was in the room when they were made. They are not lost. They are just not the version that most people know. And there is something quietly profound about knowing they exist, about knowing that the version of the story you were given was not the only version that ever existed. It is very late now, wherever you are. The room has gone quiet. The world outside has settled into whatever it settles into when the day is done. If this kind of journey into the stories behind the stories is something that you want more of, then subscribing to this channel is how you make sure more of it finds you. Drop a comment if you are still with us. Tell us what other hidden corners of this show you want to explore. The archive is deep, and we have only just begun to walk through it. Sleep well. The ghost version of the show is still out there, waiting patiently in its drawer. If you've made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. What you just experienced is a journey through one of the most complicated, most fascinating content histories in the story of American animated television. Like and subscribe if this kind of deep, slow storytelling is your thing. It helps more than you know. See you in the next one. Section 2 continued. The deeper architecture of broadcast constraint. There is a specific vocabulary that the people who work inside standards and practices departments use when they are reviewing content. And it is worth understanding that vocabulary because it shapes the kinds of decisions that produce the archive we are exploring tonight. The first distinction that matters is between content that violates the law and content that violates policy. The FCC's indecency standard is a legal framework that applies to broadcast stations. A violation of that standard can result in fines and, in extreme cases, license challenges. But the vast majority of the content decisions made by Fox's standards and practices team were not about legal violations. They were about policy decisions, about the network's own internal guidelines, about what was appropriate for their programming and their relationship with advertisers, and their position in the broader cultural conversation. The difference matters because legal constraints produce relatively predictable outcomes. If a specific word cannot be broadcast before 10 p.m., that word gets bleeped or removed, and the process for making that decision is fairly mechanical. Policy constraints are different because they are interpretive. They require someone to make a judgment about whether a specific piece of content is consistent with what the network wants to be associated with, and those judgments are influenced by everything from the current political climate to recent public controversies to the personal sensibilities of the specific people doing the reviewing. Family Guy's relationship with the standards and practices team at Fox was therefore not primarily a relationship with the law. It was primarily a relationship with institutional judgment. And institutional judgment changes over time, changes with personnel, and is influenced by external events in ways that can be difficult to predict. The Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction in 2004 is the most visible example of an external event changing the institutional judgment environment. But there were others. The September 11th attacks in 2001, which caused the Bin Laden airport scene to be removed from Road to Rhode Island, changed the institutional environment in ways that affected not just Family Guy, but every show on American broadcast television. The 2006 Danish cartoon controversy, in which editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad generated protests and violence around the world, affected the institutional environment in ways that shaped how American broadcast networks handled content involving religious figures and symbols. Family Guy's writing team was, by all accounts, aware of these environmental factors and incorporated them into their understanding of what they could and could not do in specific episodes. Some of the show's most interesting censorship stories involve content that was produced at a moment when the institutional environment made it acceptable, only to become problematic when something in the broader world changed the context. The episode PTV was produced in response to a specific moment of institutional tightening and was itself censored during that same moment of institutional tightening. The irony of an episode about censorship being censored was not lost on McFarlane or on the production team. In the DVD commentary for the episode, various members of the crew discuss the specific negotiations with the network over what the episode could contain. The horse trading that was described in the Chicago Tribune piece, where a body part reference was traded for a dirty word, gives you a sense of how granular and specific these negotiations could become. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what horse trading looks like in this context. It is not a simple matter of the show asking for one thing and the network denying it. It is a negotiation in which both sides have things they want and things they are willing to concede. And the final product is a compromise that neither side would have chosen independently, but that both sides can live with. The network wants to avoid regulatory risk and advertiser concern. The show's creative team wants to preserve the joke or the scene or the line that makes the content work. The negotiation is about finding the version of the content that satisfies both requirements sufficiently. Sometimes the negotiation fails. When the negotiation over the douchebags sequence in PTV reached a point where the modifications the network required would have fundamentally changed the nature of the joke, McFarlane made the decision to pull the sequence rather than air a compromised version. That is a specific creative position. The version that can air is not worth airing. Some jokes require their full form to land. A modified version of the joke is not the joke. This position was not always taken. There are many examples across the show's run where the modified version was produced and aired, where the writers accepted the compromise because the resulting content still functioned well enough. But the existence of the douchebags decision and the fact that the full version eventually appeared on DVD tells you something about the creative team's priorities. They were not simply trying to get content to air. They were trying to get specific content to air, and when that was not possible, they preserved the original version for the audience that would seek it out. The network's relationship with the show also changed across the years in response to the show's cultural status. In the early seasons, Family Guy was a relatively low-stakes investment for Fox. The show had not yet established the cultural footprint that would make it one of the network's most recognizable properties. In that context, the network's content review was somewhat more conservative, more cautious about material that might generate attention the network did not want. As the show became more established, the calculus changed. A Fox show that was more famous for pushing boundaries was less likely to have those boundaries pushed back because the show's identity was tied to doing exactly that. The cultural permission to be outrageous, once established, was self-reinforcing. This shift in the institutional dynamic is visible in the content history. The early seasons had relatively minor but frequent content modifications. The middle seasons, from 4 through about 10, had more significant individual modifications, but also more material that passed through review unchanged that would have been flagged earlier. The later seasons had a different dynamic still, in which the show's content was often darker and more extreme than anything from the middle period, but the institutional review process was less engaged because the show's cultural position had been established for long enough that the network trusted the audience to understand the context. The most consequential consequence of this long-term institutional shift was that some of the material in the later seasons that might have been flagged and modified or removed in the middle period passed through to broadcast unchanged. Not because the content was less extreme, but because the institutional mechanism for evaluating it had become more relaxed. The FCC's crackdown that followed the 2004 wardrobe malfunction was itself eventually walked back as the agency's enforcement priorities shifted. The specifically heightened scrutiny of the mid-2000s gave way to a more permissive environment in the early 2010s, and the show's content adjusted accordingly. What this means for the archive of unaired material is that the archive is not evenly distributed across the show's run. The middle period, from the revival through to the early 2000s, generated the largest body of cut, modified, and suppressed material. The early seasons have their own archive, but it is less thoroughly documented. The later seasons have relatively less formal censorship activity, but more internal creative moderation of the kind that happens when the show's own writers and showrunners make decisions about what the show should be doing. The archive, in other words, reflects not just the history of broadcast regulation, but the history of the show's own relationship with its identity and its limits. What was cut from the outside and what was cut from the inside are two different things, and both contribute to the ghost version of the show that runs parallel to the version you can find on any streaming platform tonight. Section 3, continued. Deeper into the first 3 seasons. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy contain specific scenes that are worth examining more closely than they typically receive, because they reveal something about what the show was attempting at its most ambitious before the cancellation changed the trajectory. The episode Da Boom, which is the second episode of the second season and aired in December 1999, takes place in a post-apocalyptic version of the show's fictional Rhode Island after a Y2K catastrophe. The episode is one of the most ambitious things the show attempted in its early years, building a sustained alternate reality story over a full 22 minutes and treating the premise with enough internal consistency to make the comedy land. The episode was produced with scenes that were modified before broadcast, including several moments involving radiation damage to the characters' bodies that Fox felt were too graphic for the Family Hour time slot. The DVD release of the episode is closer to the original production cut, but still does not include the full extent of the body horror elements that were part of the original script. Death Lives, an episode from Season 3 in which Peter dies and meets Death, who takes him back to review his life, contains extended sequences that were trimmed from the broadcast. The episode's use of Peter's memories as a device for the show's signature cutaway format was one of the more formally interesting things the early seasons attempted, and the DVD version of the episode is measurably longer than the broadcast version, with several additional memory sequences that did not make the air cut. The episode Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, in which Peter becomes the head of a tobacco company and the family's values are tested by wealth and corporate pressure, was one of the early show's most explicitly satirical pieces. Some of the content in the original production cut was more pointed in its critique of corporate lobbying and tobacco industry practices than what aired. The modifications were not dramatic, but they softened some of the sharper satirical edges of the episode in ways that the DVD version partially restores. What all 3 of these examples share is that they are from episodes that were trying to do something formally ambitious, something beyond the basic sitcom premise of the episode that usually shaped the show in its early years. The episodes that tried the hardest to be something specific and complete were also the episodes that generated the most friction with the review process, because they were committing to positions and arguments that a more episodic, joke-driven episode would not have needed to defend. This pattern of the show's most ambitious work generating the most institutional friction runs throughout the series. Partial terms of endearment is the extreme case, but it is not an exception. The episodes that were reaching for something real and specific were always more likely to run into the limits of what the institutional infrastructure would allow than the episodes that were simply being outrageous for the sake of outrage. There is also a category of content from the first 3 seasons that has only recently become available in any form. The material related to the original pitch pilot that was rediscovered in March of 2025. The full 16-minute pilot, which had been sitting on an animator's personal portfolio website since September of 2022 without anyone noticing, was shared widely after its discovery and represents the earliest surviving artifact of Family Guy as a creative project. Watching the pilot today, almost 30 years after it was made in MacFarlane's apartment, is a particular kind of experience. The animation is rougher, and the character designs are noticeably different from the broadcast versions. Lois is blonde. The children's designs are slightly off from what fans know. MacFarlane voices Chris because Seth Green had not yet been cast. But the essential rhythm of the show, the sensibility, the timing of the jokes, the specific energy of the family's dynamic is all present. The pilot also contains specific gags and moments that did not make it into the broadcast version of the premiere episode. The chicken fajitas gag, referenced in materials from around 1999 and visible in a still image that Fox used for their online store during the show's early run, appears in the pilot in a slightly different form than any surviving documentation suggested it had taken. The pilot's version of the welfare fraud premise is resolved differently from the broadcast version, with specific details of the ending that were changed in the revision process. The discovery of the pilot after more than 25 years of being effectively lost, sitting unnoticed on the internet while people who had been searching for it for years did not find it, is itself a parable about the nature of the archive. The most important documents are not always the hardest to find. Sometimes they are simply in a place where nobody thought to look. Section 5, continued. The revival seasons and the shape of what was kept. The fourth and fifth seasons of Family Guy, which ran from 2005 to 2007, are the period when the show's relationship with its own content became most visible and most publicly discussed. The Adult Swim reruns had created an audience that knew, at least conceptually, that there were different versions of the episodes they had seen on Fox. The DVD releases from this period were commercially successful in large part because fans wanted the uncensored content. The show was navigating a market incentive to produce more extreme content for the physical media, while also navigating a regulatory incentive to be more careful about what aired on broadcast. This dual pressure shaped the episodes from these seasons in specific ways. Some episodes were produced with the DVD version already in mind, with scenes that were written knowing they would not air on Fox but would appear on the DVD. This practice of producing content for a secondary market while presenting a modified version to the broadcast audience was not unique to Family Guy. Adult animated shows on cable were doing similar things, but Family Guy's situation was distinctive because it was a broadcast show, subject to FCC oversight, that was also producing explicitly adult content for physical media. The episode Deep Throats from the fourth season is the clearest example of this dual-track production approach. The episode's centerpiece scene, in which Brian and Stewie walk in on Peter and Lois on the couch while both are under the influence of marijuana, was produced in two versions from the outset. The broadcast version drew underwear on the characters. The DVD version did not. Lois's suggestive line about what Peter was doing to her was included in the DVD version and removed from the broadcast version. The alternate animations required to dress the characters for the broadcast were additional production work that would not have been needed if the show had been producing content only for the DVD market. The fact that this additional work was done tells you something about the show's relationship with the broadcast audience versus the DVD audience. The show was not simply producing one version and then modifying it for broadcast. It was producing two versions, understanding that both audiences had different expectations and that serving both required different content. The broadcast audience expected a specific kind of toned-down version of Family Guy that was still recognizably the show. The DVD audience expected the version that the show had actually meant to make. The Season 5 episode Barely Legal occupies a particularly interesting position in the archive of what was modified versus what was preserved. The episode is one of the most discussed in the show's history because of its central premise, Meg's romantic obsession with Brian after he takes her to prom. The episode's premise was already dark, combining the show's established pattern of using Meg as a vehicle for dark comedy with a romantic dynamics that the show normally would not have pursued seriously. The broadcast version was already uncomfortable in ways that the show usually was not. The DVD version extended several scenes in the episode's final act to make the discomfort more explicit and more sustained. What is notable about the extended DVD version of Barely Legal is not that it is significantly more graphic than the broadcast version in terms of explicit content. It is not in the conventional sense. What the extended version does is give the scene more time, more silence, more space for the implications of what is happening to land. And in an animated comedy, where the pace of the jokes usually prevents any single moment from sitting long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable, that additional time changes the experience of watching considerably. The producer's decision to include this extended version on the DVD was not purely commercial. The DVD commentary for the episode discusses the creative reasons for the extension, noting that the broadcast version felt rushed in a way that undercut the effectiveness of the episode's final act. The argument being made is not that the extended version is more explicit, it is that the extended version is better. And the broadcast audience, who saw the compressed version, got a different and in some ways lesser version of the episode than the DVD audience. The fifth season was also the period when the Road to episodes, particularly Road to Rupert, began generating their own bodies of supplementary material. Road to Rupert is the fourth entry in the series of Brian and Stewie adventure episodes, and the DVD release of the episode includes extended scenes of the two characters' journey that were cut from the broadcast primarily for time. The additional material is not censored content in the regulatory sense. It is simply material that the broadcast episode did not have room for. But it exists, and it is part of the more complete version of the episode that the production team made. The sixth season brought the two-part Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie episodes, which are often cited as the high-water mark of the show's aspirational ambition in its middle period. The episodes committed to a premise that the show had always flirted with, but never fully executed. What would happen if Stewie actually followed through on his stated intention to kill Lois? The two-parter gave a specific and dramatically satisfying answer to that question, complete with Stewie achieving his long-stated goals of world domination, only to have the whole thing revealed as a simulation. The DVD releases of these episodes contain extended versions of the simulation reveal sequence and of several action set pieces that were trimmed from the broadcast. The extended material does not substantially change the episode's meaning, but it adds depth to specific moments and gives the drama more room to breathe. The production team, in the commentary, discussed the challenge of making a genuinely dramatic and emotionally engaging two-part episode, while also serving the expectations of a comedy audience that was not necessarily accustomed to taking the show seriously for 44 consecutive minutes. The seventh season contained an episode, 420, that generated its own specific content negotiation with Fox. The episode follows Brian's campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional Rhode Island town, and generated, as noted in the transcript that forms the template for the script, an international controversy when Venezuelan authorities reacted to the episode as an example of American drug promotion. The episode that aired on Fox was a modified version of the original production cut, with some of the more direct advocacy for marijuana legalization softened or reframed. The DVD version is closer to the original, though the differences are subtle enough that casual viewers would not immediately notice them. The fact that a cartoon about a talking dog advocating for marijuana legalization generated a formal government response from a foreign country and led to content modifications in the broadcast version tells you something about the intersection of comedy and policy that the show was navigating. It was not trying to be a policy document. It was trying to be a comedy episode. But the specific positions the show was taking on a constant political question had real-world implications that extended well beyond the entertainment context in which they were made. Section 6 continued. The Brian and Stewie Archive, the final lost chapters. There is a specific episode that exists in the show's history that is rarely discussed in the context of what was cut or modified, but that deserves attention precisely because of how complete and uncompromised it is. Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode that locked its two central characters in a bank vault for a full 22 minutes, went through the network review process in a way that was different from most of the show's more controversial content. The episode's subject matter was, by any conventional measure, more emotionally raw than almost anything the show had done. The discussion of Brian's darker emotional states, the revelation of the gun in the safety deposit box, the explicit articulation of the limits of Stewie's tolerance for the world's indifference to his emotional needs. These are not the kinds of content that typically generate regulatory concern. They are not indecent in the FCC's sense. They are not offensive in the advertiser sensitivity sense. But they are, in a way that is harder to categorize, deeply adult. They require the audience to take the characters seriously in a way that the show's usual format does not. The network's review of Brian and Stewie focused primarily on the gun, and specifically on whether the episode's treatment of Brian's darker emotional states constituted the kind of content that required editorial intervention. The show had a history of using dark subject matter as comedy, and the line between comedy that uses darkness and content that depicts darkness seriously was one of the things that the review process was designed to evaluate. The decision was made to allow the episode to air with minimal modifications, which speaks to the coherence of the episode's creative vision. When the material being reviewed is clearly purposeful, when it is not gratuitous, when it is serving a specific and defensible narrative function, the institutional review process is more likely to allow it. Brian and Stewie passed through review not because it was harmless, but because it was intentional. And intentionality has a way of disarming the institutional anxiety that accompanies content that merely seems to be reaching for shock. The episode that was produced as a companion piece to Brian and Stewie, a less discussed entry from the same season, demonstrates the counterpoint. This episode involved Brian in a storyline that was, by the production team's own account in the DVD commentary, less carefully considered and more directly aiming for a reaction than for a specific creative effect. The material in that episode that generated content review was reviewed more critically precisely because the intent was less clear. When the show was clearly doing something, the review process could evaluate it on those terms. When the show was simply pushing, without a clear direction, the review process pushed back. This distinction between purposeful darkness and gratuitous darkness runs through the entire archive of what was and was not allowed to air. The show was allowed to do genuinely dark things when those things were in service of something recognizable as a creative intention. The show was more likely to have content modified or removed when the darkness was not obviously in service of anything. The road to episodes from the later seasons generated their own extended DVD materials in ways that were consistent with the middle period episodes, but with different specific content. Road to the North Pole from the 9th season, an extended episode that runs significantly longer than a standard Family Guy episode, had DVD content that included extended versions of several of the episode's more disturbing Santa Claus sequences. The episode's premise, which involves Brian and Stewie discovering that the commercial Christmas industry has made Santa Claus physically ill and emotionally broken, goes to places that the broadcast version only partly realized. The DVD version includes additional material from the North Pole sequence that makes the episode's central conceit considerably more affecting than the broadcast version allows. Road to the Multiverse from the same season had DVD material that included alternate universe sequences that were produced for the episode and removed during the editing process. The episode, which is one of the most formally inventive things the show produced in its later years, takes Brian and Stewie through multiple alternate versions of reality, each animated in a different style to reflect the alternate world. The DVD version includes an additional alternate universe that was removed from the broadcast cut for reasons that the commentary describes as relating to the specific stylistic choice the sequence required, not landing as effectively as the other sequences. The cut from Road to the Multiverse is a rare example of content being removed not for regulatory reasons, not for tonal reasons, and not because of network review. It was removed because the production team, in their own evaluation, decided that the sequence was not achieving its intended effect. This is the most fundamental kind of creative edit, the kind that happens in every artistic project when the artist or the team decides that something is not working. And even in this case, the sequence was not destroyed. It exists in the DVD release, documented in the commentary, available to the audience that wants to evaluate for themselves whether it worked or not. The most profound thing about the Brian and Stewie archive is not any specific piece of content, but the arc it describes. Two characters who were not supposed to have a central relationship, who were placed together by creative accident and discovered through the process of being written and performed together that they had something extraordinary to offer each other, generated over 20 years of material that was cut and modified and restored and cut again. Their relationship was the most consistently fruitful source of the show's emotional content. And it was also the source of the show's most complex negotiations with itself and with the institutions that oversaw its broadcast. The scenes that were cut from their interactions tend to be either more vulnerable or more cruel than what aired. The vulnerability, when it was cut, was usually cut because it made the tone of a comedy episode too somber. The cruelty, when it was cut because it went further than the show was willing to go on broadcast, even given its tolerance for dark comedy. Both kinds of cuts tell you something about the shape of the relationship as the show had developed it, and both kinds of missing material leave a ghost in the finished product. A sense of something that was reached for and pulled back from. Section 7 continued. The Violence Archive. The physical comedy in Family Guy underwent a transformation across the show's run that is visible in the broadcast episodes, but is even more stark in the DVD releases and the archive of what was cut or modified. The early seasons used cartoon violence in the tradition of classic animation, exaggerated and consequence-free in the way that allows comedy to use physical harm without implication. Characters got hurt in ways that would be devastating in reality, and were funny precisely because the show's cartoon logic protected them from those consequences. The evolution away from this kind of consequence-free cartoon violence towards something more realistic and more graphic was gradual and then sudden. The gradual phase covered the revival seasons and the early middle period. The sudden phase came in roughly the ninth and 10th seasons, when the level of detail in the depictions of injury in certain episodes shifted dramatically. The DVD material from this period contains extended versions of several of the show's extended injury sequences that are measurably more graphic than the broadcast versions. In some cases, the additional material involves extended depictions of injuries that the broadcast version cuts away from at the moment of maximum impact. In other cases, the additional material involves sound design details, the specific quality of impact sounds or reactions, that were modified in the broadcast version to be less visceral. The giant chicken fights, which are among the show's most beloved recurring elements, grew considerably more detailed in their later iterations. The fight in Internal Affairs from the ninth season is significantly longer and more elaborate in its DVD version than in the broadcast cut. The fight in The Chicken Fights Back is even more extended, with sequences that push the cartoon violence into territory that is closer to a martial arts film than to the cartoon slapstick of the early fights. These sequences were subject to review primarily for their length and their level of detail, with the network concerned that content that went on for extended periods at this level of visual intensity exceeded what was appropriate for the family viewing hour. The broader pattern of the violence archive reflects something about the show's relationship with escalation. Once you have done something once, the next time needs to be at least as good, and usually bigger. The giant chicken fights had to keep growing. The injury gags had to keep intensifying. The graphic content had to maintain its capacity to surprise. This escalation dynamic was one of the forces that drove the show's content into territory that the broadcast could not always accommodate, and the DVD archive of what was cut from the violence content grows larger and more specific as the seasons advance. Section 8 continued. The supporting characters' full story. The characters at the margins of Family Guy's family and community tell a different story about what the show was attempting, and where its ambitions were sometimes better than its reputation suggests. Death, the recurring character who appeared first in the premiere episode and who was voiced by Norm Macdonald in his original appearance and later by Adam Carolla, was one of the show's early experiments with giving a recurring supporting figure genuine character development. The early Death episodes, including Death is a Bitch from Season 2, contained DVD material that extended Death's character beyond the gag function he serves in the broadcast version. In the extended material, Death's loneliness and his complicated relationship with the human mortality he administers are given more room than the broadcast versions allow. The additional material makes Death more interesting, more sympathetic, and more useful as a recurring character than he appears in the broadcast cuts. The recurring doctors and medical professionals who appear throughout the show's run, particularly Dr. Hartman, are given extended scenes on several DVD releases that develop their characters in ways the broadcast episodes do not. Dr. Hartman in particular is a character whose comic potential was recognized early, but whose development was always limited by the demands of his plot function. The DVD versions of several episodes featuring Hartman include additional scenes that are more character-driven and less purely functional than what made the broadcast cut. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the news anchor characters who provide the show's fictional news broadcasts, were developed in ways across the early seasons that were partially visible in the broadcast but more fully realized in the DVD material. The episode And Then There Were Fewer from Season 9, in which Diane Simmons reveals herself as a killer during a murder mystery dinner party, was one of the more dramatically ambitious things the show attempted in the supporting cast. The extended DVD version of the episode's climactic sequence gives Diane's villainy more room to develop than the broadcast version, with additional dialogue that contextualizes her actions in ways that make the episode's dramatic arc more coherent. Quagmire's backstory episodes, including Quagmire's Dad from Season 8 and Quagmire's Baby from the 10th season, were reviewed carefully during production because they touched on subjects that required specific handling. Quagmire's Dad introduced the revelation that Quagmire's father is a transgender woman, and the episode generated significant discussion during production about how to handle the subject with appropriate care while maintaining the show's comedy voice. The broadcast version reflected many rounds of revision. The DVD version includes additional material from the original production cut that was removed during the broadcast revision process, some of which handles the subject with more nuance than what aired, and some of which was removed precisely because it was less carefully considered than the revised version. The treatment of Cleveland Brown across his years as a regular character and his transition to the spin-off Cleveland Show and back to Family Guy is a specific chapter in the supporting cast archive. Cleveland was, by the accounts of people who worked on the show, a character whose potential was recognized but not fully realized within the Family Guy format. His removal to the spin-off was meant to give him room to develop as a central character rather than a supporting one. When the spin-off ended and Cleveland returned to Family Guy, the integration of his more developed characterization from the spin-off into the ensemble dynamic generated episodes that were different in their approach to him than the early seasons had been. The DVD material from his later Family Guy appearances reflects this development, with extended scenes that give Cleveland more complexity than his early season characterization had permitted. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, who was pregnant for 7 seasons before finally giving birth in season 8, generated her own archive of cut material across the seasons of her pregnancy. The joke of the extended pregnancy, which was a running gag that acknowledged the show's lack of continuity by simply never advancing the plot point, was treated differently in episodes that explored it in more detail. Some of the extended DVD material from the Bonnie storylines in the middle seasons is more serious in its engagement with the character's situation, her relationship with Joe, her isolation, and her frustrations than the broadcast versions allowed. The show occasionally tried to take Bonnie seriously, and the archive of what was cut from her more serious moments is a record of those attempts. Section 9 continued. The voice booth's unrecorded history. The voice recording sessions for Family Guy generated their own informal archive that is, in most cases, completely inaccessible. What happened in the recording booth between takes, the improvisations that did not make it to the final mix, the experiments with character voices, the moments when a performer found something unexpected in a piece of material and extended it further than the script asked, all of this is gone unless someone had the foresight to keep a record. There are a small number of documented cases of voice performances that went beyond what was scripted and were preserved in one form or another. The character of Brian Griffin, who was McFarlane performing without any alteration to his own speaking voice, according to the production records, was one of the characters whose recorded sessions generated the most material beyond the scripted lines. Brian's voice was McFarlane's own, which gave him a different relationship to the character's dialogue than he had with Peter or Stewie or Quagmire, all of which required him to shift his voice significantly from his natural register. The comfort and ease of recording Brian meant that the sessions were more likely to include off-script material. The DVD commentary tracks, particularly those from the 4th and 5th seasons, occasionally reference alternate takes of specific lines that were more extreme or more suggestive than what appeared in the final episode. The most frequently mentioned alternate takes in the commentaries involve dialogue that was written one way and then changed during recording, because the original version was either not landing as intended or was pushing against content review in ways that could be addressed through the recording rather than through script revision. McFarlane's own accounts of his recording process describe a physical and creative intensity that is not fully visible in the finished product. He has discussed being pushed into recording sessions when he was ill or exhausted by the production schedule, and he has noted that the show's production timeline often required him to record with less preparation time than he would have preferred. The recordings made under these conditions, when he was tired or under weather, sometimes produced performances that were different in character from the polished version the show usually aired. Some of those performances were, by his own account, actually better, carrying a rawness that the more controlled takes did not have. Others were simply different, neither better nor worse, but representing a version of the character that did not quite match the one the episode needed. The production's decision to have writers perform lines during the writing and development process, rather than relying entirely on the voice cast, created another layer of performance history that is even less recoverable than the voice booth archive. When a writer performed a joke at a table read in the specific way they had imagined it, and the table read response shaped how the joke was subsequently written and staged, the original performance existed only in that room on that day. The joke that made it to air was a descendant of that performance, shaped by it but not identical to it. There is one piece of voice performance history that is more thoroughly documented than most, and it belongs to the production of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The original table read of the episode's draft, which took place on March 17, 1999, is documented in the script materials that eventually made it to the Internet Archive. The document includes notes on readings, reactions, and the specific ways in which the performance of the material at the table read shaped the subsequent revisions. Reading the table draft alongside the notes is the closest thing that exists to hearing that room on that day, to understanding how the episode's writers heard their own material, and how that hearing led to the revisions that produced the episode that eventually aired. The gap between the table-read draft and the final broadcast version of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is a record of creative process at work. The episode improved in specific documented ways between its first reading and its eventual airing 4 years later. The improvements were shaped by the table read responses, by the network review process, by the passage of time that gave the writers a longer perspective on what they were doing, and by the specific regulatory and cultural environment that governed what the episode could contain. That record of improvement across 4 years, visible in the documents, is perhaps the most hopeful thing in the entire archive. It is evidence that the gap between what was first imagined and what eventually reached the audience was, in this specific case, a gap that the show crossed by getting better. The cuts and the modifications and the years of waiting were not simply losses. They were, in this case, part of a creative process that produced something more considered and more effective than the original version would have been. Not all of the archive is a story of loss. Some of it is a story of revision. The two are not always easy to distinguish, and they are not always separate. But knowing that both are present in the history of what this show made and what it was prevented from making is important to how you understand the ghost version of the show that runs alongside the one you know. Section 10, continued. The International Dimension. The story of Family Guy's censorship history is not purely an American story. The show aired in more than 200 countries, and the content standards that governed those broadcasts were as varied as the countries themselves. In the United Kingdom, where the BBC aired the show in its primetime slot, the content standards were in many respects more permissive than Fox's. The BBC's programming regulations do not include the FCC's specific definition of indecency, and the watershed that governs what can be shown before 9 p.m. in the UK is applied differently than the American safe harbor provision. As a result, the UK broadcasts of Family Guy sometimes included content that was modified or removed from the American broadcast. The most significant example of this disparity is Partial Terms of Endearment, which aired in the UK in 2010 and was watched by nearly 1 million homes in its initial broadcast. The episode that Fox refused to air, that has never been broadcast on American television, played in the UK as a standard Season 8 episode. The BBC's review process did not find the episode's subject matter too problematic for primetime broadcast. The cultural and regulatory context in which abortion is discussed in the UK is different enough from the American context that the episode's content did not trigger the same institutional anxiety that it did at Fox. This international disparity raises questions about what censorship actually represents. When the same episode is acceptable in one country and unbroadcastable in another, the content itself is not the variable. The variable is the institutional and cultural context in which the content is evaluated. The episode is not inherently too extreme or not extreme enough. It is too extreme for Fox's assessment of its American audience in 2010, and not too extreme for the BBC's assessment of its British audience in the same year. Venezuela's ban on Family Guy following the broadcast of 420 is another example of the international dimension. The Venezuelan government's position that the episode was an example of American drug promotion led to formal warnings to cable operators about future broadcasts of the show. This response was itself a specific cultural and political phenomenon, reflecting the Venezuelan government's broader position on American cultural exports during that period. The episode that generated this response was a comedy about a talking dog leading a marijuana legalization campaign in a fictional Rhode Island town. The gap between the content and the governmental response is, depending on your perspective, either a testament to the show's reach or a commentary on the sensitivity of political environments to perceived challenges to social norms. Australia's handling of Family Guy content is a smaller but similarly illustrative example. The country's Broadcast Standards Authority reviewed several episodes across the show's run and issued findings that resulted in specific content modifications for Australian broadcasts that differed from both the American and UK versions. The specifics of these modifications are documented in the authority's public records and reveal a pattern of concerns that overlapped partially but not completely with the concerns of Fox's Standards and Practices Department. The existence of multiple internationally different versions of the same episodes adds another layer to the archive. The version that aired in Germany might be different from the version that aired in Australia, which might be different from the version that aired in the UK, which is different from the version that aired in the US. Each of these versions is a document of the institutional and cultural context in which it was produced. The German version reflects German broadcast standards. The Australian version reflects Australian broadcast standards, and so on. For completists and archivists, this multiplicity of versions is both a challenge and a resource. It means that in some cases, the most complete version of a specific episode exists not in the American DVD release, but in a specific international broadcast version that preserved content that all the American versions modified. The Bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island, for example, is available on the UK and German DVD releases in addition to the American Freakin' Sweet collection. For fans who did not have access to the specialty American DVD, the international releases served as the archive. This international dimension of the content history is one of the less thoroughly documented aspects of the show's archive, largely because the records of international broadcast decisions are scattered across multiple regulatory bodies in multiple countries, and are not as easily accessible as the DVD commentary tracks and production documents that form the core of the American archive. But it is an important dimension because it tells you that what you were not allowed to see on American television was, in many cases, something that audiences in other countries saw without incident. Section 11, continued. The streaming era and the new archive. The transition from DVD to streaming as the primary way that audiences accessed Family Guy's back catalog changed the content history in specific and consequential ways. The DVD releases had been the secondary archive, the place where the uncut material lived. When streaming became the primary distribution method, the question of which version of the material would stream became crucial. The answer, in most cases, was the broadcast version. Hulu, which is the primary streaming home of Family Guy in the United States, streams the Fox broadcast versions of the episodes. The uncut DVD material is not available through Hulu. The episodes that viewers access on streaming are the censored versions, with bleeps and modified scenes and removed content, even though the uncut versions exist and have been commercially released. Disney Plus, which acquired Family Guy content through Disney's purchase of 21st Century Fox, streams the broadcast versions of the episodes in the seasons it carries. The streaming service does not carry partial terms of endearment at all, and the versions of the episodes it does carry reflect Fox's broadcast standards rather than the production team's original creative intentions. This migration from DVD to streaming effectively reversed the archive dynamic that had existed during the DVD era. In the DVD era, the complete version was accessible to anyone who sought it out. In the streaming era, the complete version is inaccessible to the vast majority of the audience. The streaming versions of the episodes are the only versions most people will ever see, and those versions are the broadcast versions. The implications for the content history are significant. The archive that was built across the show's run, the secondary record of what the show was actually made to be, is increasingly inaccessible to the audiences who care about it. The physical media that housed the archive is in decline as a commercial format. The streaming services that now distribute the show have no commercial incentive to include the uncut material, and in some cases have regulatory and reputational incentives not to. The result is that the ghost version of the show, the fuller and more complete version, is retreating from accessibility at the same pace that new audiences are encountering the show for the first time. The people who are watching Family Guy for the first time on a streaming platform tonight are watching a version of the show that is different in specific ways from the version that the show's creators made. They may not know that. The streaming platform does not announce the differences. The episodes run without any indication that they have been modified from the production intent. This situation is not unique to Family Guy. The entire tradition of broadcast television content being modified from its original creative form, and the modified version becoming the default accessible version, is as old as broadcast television itself. What is distinctive about Family Guy is the extent of the documentation, the size of the gap between the broadcast and the uncut versions, and the clarity with which the production team itself articulated, through DVD commentaries and interviews, the difference between what was made and what was allowed to air. The DVD era gave viewers the tools to understand that gap. The streaming era is removing those tools from most viewers' reach. Section 12 continued. What the archive tells us. Sitting with all of this material, with the bins and the Lois scene and the Kennedy Pez dispensers, and the Bin Laden show tune and the douchebag sequence and the Peter is slow musical number and the partial terms of endearment episode that never aired in America and the Boston Marathon gag that was yanked from streaming for 9 years and the table read of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein that happened on March 17th, 1999. What does it tell us about the show that made all of this material? It tells us that the show was trying. Even in the seasons when it was trying badly, or trying in ways that seem misconceived in retrospect, it was trying. The people who made it were attempting to do something specific, to push the boundaries of what an animated comedy could be and do and say. Some of those attempts succeeded. Some of them did not. Some of them were prevented from reaching the audience by institutions that had legitimate reasons for the restrictions they imposed, and some of them were prevented for reasons that seem, in retrospect, more about institutional caution than about genuine protection of the audience. The archive does not tell us that Family Guy was a perfect show. It tells us that it was a more ambitious show than the version that aired on broadcast television fully reveals. The ambition was sometimes in the service of genuine comedy. It was sometimes in the service of genuine satire. It was sometimes in the service of shock for its own sake. And it was, on at least one occasion, in the service of something that most American television would still not attempt today. A clear-eyed and honest engagement with a contested moral question that was willing to take a position and say it out loud. The Bin Laden scene and the partial terms of endearment episode exist at opposite ends of the archive. The Bin Laden scene was removed because the world caught up with the joke in the worst possible way. The abortion episode was prevented from airing because the institutional environment in American broadcast television decided it was not ready for the conversation. Both of these represent limitations on what the show could be and do. But they are different kinds of limitations, and understanding the difference matters. The Bin Laden scene is a limitation that feels, in retrospect, right. The judgment that the scene could not be separated from the grief of September 11th was a human judgment made with care for real people's real pain. The prevention of partial terms of endearment from airing in the United States feels different because the stated reason for the prevention was not human grief, but institutional anxiety and commercial calculation. The Fox Entertainment president who described the subject matter as fragile at an extremely fragile economic time was not expressing a concern for the audience. He was expressing a concern for the revenue. That distinction matters when you are trying to understand what an archive of unaired material tells you about the culture that produced it. The censorship that comes from human sensitivity to real suffering is different from the censorship that comes from institutional risk aversion. Both are present in Family Guy's history. Both left their marks on what the show was and was not allowed to be. The show is still being made. It will continue to be made through at least 2028 and 2029, under the terms of the mega deal announced in April of 2025. The archive is still growing. There are episodes being produced right now in the animation studios and the recording booths that will generate their own bodies of modified and removed content. The ghost version of the show is still being written, and somewhere in the quiet of a production office, in the archive of a streaming company or a physical media vault, in the memory of someone who was in a room on a specific day when a specific choice was made about what the world would and would not be allowed to see, the fuller version of the story continues to exist. Patient, complete, waiting for the audience that is willing to look for it. That is where we leave it tonight. Not with a conclusion, because the archive does not end. Not with a summary, because the material is too varied and too human to be summarized adequately. But with an acknowledgement that the show you know and the show that was made are the same show in some ways and different shows in others, and that the space between those two versions is one of the most interesting places in the history of American television. The space is real. The show that lived there was real. The people who made it were real. And the choices that were made about what the world was ready to see and what it was not were as human as anything in the show itself. Sleep well. If this journey has been worth your time, the like button is there, the subscribe button is right beside it, and the comment section below is open and waiting for wherever you are and whatever time it is where you are watching. We will see you in the next one. Appendix: The Mechanics of an Archive. How the Shadow History was built. There is one final thing worth saying before we close the vault tonight, and it is about how archives of this kind get built at all. Most of what you have just heard exists because of a specific combination of factors that are not always present in the history of other television shows. The first factor is the existence of a passionate and technically capable fan community that cared enough about the material to track it down, document it, discuss it, and preserve it. The Lost Media Wiki, which is one of the primary public repositories for information about what has been found and what is not, represents thousands of hours of collective effort by people who were motivated purely by the desire to know what existed and to preserve it. The second factor is the DVD era. Without the commercial incentive to produce physical media releases that offered the audience something beyond the broadcast version, the uncut material might never have been made commercially available in any form. The DVD releases of the first few seasons, which arrived at exactly the moment when the show was building its cult following through Adult Swim reruns, created the relationship between the show and its audience that made the secondary archive economically viable. People bought the discs. The sales justified making more discs with more uncut content. The uncut content became part of the show's identity. The third factor is the commentary track tradition. Seth MacFarlane and the various members of the production team who participated in the DVD commentaries were unusually candid about the production process, about what had been cut and why, about their own artistic intentions and the compromises they had made. This candor was not universal across all commentaries, but it was present in enough of them to constitute a documentary record that goes significantly deeper than the typical promotional material that accompanies television DVD releases. The fourth factor is the specific quality of Family Guy, as a show that had a documented relationship with censorship as a theme. An episode like PTV, which was explicitly about the tension between creative freedom and broadcast regulation, invited the production team to discuss that tension openly. The meta-awareness of the show about its own content history made it easier for the people who made it to talk about that history, because the show itself had already made the topic public. The fifth and final factor is time. 25 years of production history, spread across multiple television seasons, multiple DVD releases, multiple streaming migrations, multiple international broadcasts, and multiple regulatory environments, created a large enough body of documented variation to make the archive substantial. A show that had run for 5 seasons would have a much smaller and less complex content history. The longevity that also contributed to the show's creative decline is the same longevity that made the archive so rich. Understanding these factors helps explain why Family Guy has such a thoroughly documented shadow history when other shows with similarly complicated content relationships do not. It is not only that Family Guy pushed against the limits of what broadcast television would allow, many shows did that. It is that Family Guy pushed those limits at a specific historical moment, in a specific commercial context, with a specific level of creative transparency for a specific duration, in a way that created the conditions for the documentation of the pushing. The archive exists because of a confluence of commerce, creativity, technology, time, and the particular passion of a community of fans who believe out the complete version of the show was worth finding. That confluence is not reproducible. The era of DVD secondary archives has ended. The era of detailed production commentary tracks is declining. The era of fan-driven archival research is changing as the tools available for that research change. What we have is what we have. The archive that was built during the show's run is the archive that exists. The material that was documented is documented. The material that was not documented is gone, or close enough to gone that the distinction is academic. The ghost version of the show that runs alongside the broadcast version is as complete as it is ever going to be. And it is, despite its incompleteness, a remarkable thing. A record of ambition and compromise and institutional negotiation and creative courage and commercial calculation, and occasionally, genuine artistic achievement in the face of genuine institutional resistance. A record of a show that was trying to be more than it was allowed to be, and that succeeded in preserving enough of that ambition in the secondary archive that we can still, sitting here tonight, encounter it and understand what was being reached for. The reaching matters. Even when the reach does not result in a landing, even when the material is cut or banned or modified or held for years in a filing cabinet before finally being released on a specialty DVD. The reaching is the record of people who cared about what they were making, who wanted it to be more than the institutional constraints would allow, and who found ways through DVD releases and commentary tracks and the careful documentation of a fan community to leave behind a record of what the full version looked like. That record is the shadow of the show, and the shadow, tonight, is where we have been living. Rest well in it. A final note. Why this kind of history matters. It would be easy to treat the archive of Family Guy's unaired material as simply a curiosity, a collection of interesting footnotes for dedicated fans. But there is a reason this history matters beyond the specific show and the specific moments it contains. Every piece of creative work that passes through an institutional distribution system leaves behind a version of itself that is shaped by the requirements and anxieties of that system. The version that reaches the audience is never identical to the version that was made. Between the making and the receiving, there is always a negotiation, and that negotiation leaves marks. Sometimes those marks are improvements. Sometimes they are losses. Most often, they are both. Understanding those marks is understanding something real about how culture is produced and how it reaches us. The version of a story you know is not the only version that existed. The version of a comedy you watched growing up was shaped by forces that had interests that were not identical to the interests of the people who made it. Some of those forces were legitimate. Some were not. The archive tells you which is which, if you are willing to look at it closely. Family Guy is a useful case study for this kind of examination, precisely because its archive is so thoroughly documented, because the show's own creators were so willing to discuss the gap between their intentions and the broadcast version, and because the show's subject matter and its content history are so closely entangled. The show that was making jokes about censorship was being censored. The show that was trying to say something honest about abortion was banned from saying it. The show that was exploring the limits of what animation could do emotionally was sometimes prevented from going as far as its best episodes proved it could go. The archive of the unaired material is the record of those entanglements. It is the record of a show trying to be more than the institutional structures around it would allow, and of the specific ways in which it succeeded and failed in that attempt. It is also the record of a fan community that cared enough to document and preserve and debate the meaning of those attempts. We preserve these histories because they tell us something true about how creative work moves through the world. Not because every piece of suppressed or modified material was a masterpiece. Not because the version of the show that was prevented from airing was always better than the version that was allowed to. But because the gap between the two versions, the space where the negotiations happened and the decisions were made and the material was cut or held or modified, that gap is where the real story of any creative work actually lives. And if knowing that changes how you watch the show, if knowing that there was always a fuller version somewhere, a more complete expression of what the people who made it were trying to do, if that changes the texture of what you watch even slightly, then the archive has done its job. The vault is never really closed, it just gets harder to find. Good night.